Hi, I'm Jess Fields. Welcome to the show. The other day I interviewed Dr. Ryan Burge. Now, you may not have heard of Dr. Burge, but you've probably heard of his work because of the idea of the religious none. That is None, none. These are people that answer on a survey nothing in particular when asked what their religion is, and they are now the largest single group in American religion. Well, Dr. Burge helped identify this trend. He's a professor at Eastern Illinois University, and he happens to be a pastor in the American Baptist denomination. The interview goes a little long, but I couldn't bring myself to cut it down. It's a very interesting, data-filled analysis of the rise of religious nuns and the decline of religion in America. And so, please enjoy this interview with Dr. Ryan Burge. Joining me now is Professor Ryan Burge, who is a professor at Eastern Illinois University and an American Baptist pastor. Professor, thank you for joining me today.
It's my pleasure to be here.
Well, let's start by talking about how you got to where you are. You're an American Baptist pastor as well as a professor. You talk a lot about the intersection of religion and politics in America. What's a little bit about your biography?
Yeah, grew up in a small town in Southern Illinois, a place called Salem, birthplace of William Jennings Bryan, only president to run, or try to run for president 3 times and lose for a major party 3 times. I grew up evangelical in the Southern Baptist Church, First Baptist Church of Salem, Illinois. Very involved in youth group, went to all the church camps and activities and all that kind of stuff. Went to a small Free Methodist college for undergrad, a place called Greenville College. Used to be called college. Now it's Greenville University. They changed their name. And then I got a PhD in political science at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. I have been a pastor of my current church, First Baptist Church of Mount Vernon, Illinois, for almost 13 and a half years now. Before that, I was a youth pastor for 3 years. So about 17 years all told in ministry to the American Baptist churches. Like you said, I'm an assistant professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University. I write, blog, tweet, mix it up on the areas of religion and American politics, religious demography. I'm a quant. I'm a stats guy. So charts and graphs are the name of the game for me. That's the world that I live in. The currency that sort of flows through my veins is what's the data say? What I don't care about your opinion. I care what the data says. And my job, as best as I understand it, is to try to explain the world to people in ways that they don't understand or can't fully conceptualize. I always joke with people that most people, we don't even understand the world that's happening right now, let alone the world that happened 40 years ago. Because we just don't have perfect vision, right? So data is great in that way because it can give us an objective, as objective as you can get, an objective view of the world 30 or 40 years ago, and it can really track meaningful change over time, right? So that's sort of the goal of what I do, is just sort of reveal the way the world is and where it was 30 years ago, is to get people a sense of where they fall in the story, the grand narrative of American politics and American religion.
So kind of stemming from that, then I think the natural question, because a lot of people obviously these days are pundits. Everyone is a pundit.
Yes.
All you have to do is go on YouTube and, well, heck, this podcast, obviously, although I'm not a pundit, this is intended to be a news show and
Sure.
and neutral. But, where do you come down politically? I mean, would you
Mhm.
call yourself on the right, on the left, in the center? I think there's been several in the religion blogosphere that have tried to pin you down, and
Sure.
it seems that you resist such labels, though.
Yeah, no, I'm an empirical guy. Like, that's what I believe in. I believe in empirics, and I believe in the capital T truth. And I don't think data is partisan, right? Like, I'm really bad when I go to think, so like, what does this mean for us? What should we do? And I'm like, I don't know. That's not my job, right? My job is to tell you how the world works, and then you like make sense of that for yourself, right? So when I teach my grad students, especially, I try to say that we need to avoid being what's called normative. We can't make normative statements like, should we do this? Or should the government do that? Like, our job is not to say, should we do something? Our job is to say, if we did it, what would the outcomes be financially, societally, culturally, if we made these changes, right? And if you do that, people from both sides of the aisle are going to respect you a lot more, because they realize you're not trying to score points or make one side look good or one side look bad. And when you do make one side look good, people know that you're doing that because the data does that, not because you personally want to do that. So I try to describe the world the way it is, not the way you wish it to be or hope it to be or want it to be, but just to show you the world as it is today. And then that can help you think about the world and your place in it. So when I talk about partisanship, I try to be an academic in the truest sense, which means I'm nonpartisan or bipartisan, or everyone's welcome. I will throw stones at everyone and I will make everyone look good. Just depends on what the data says.
So Terry Mattingly, not to press this point too much, but who I interviewed recently on this program and is a
Yeah.
well-known religion journalist, I think called you a progressive Baptist pastor. I bring
Yeah.
that up because Dr. Burge, as you're aware, and anyone listening or watching this, many Baptist pastors, I think, if they are cited in the sphere of politics, I think are
Yeah.
considered to be more on the right wing or the
Uh-huh.
conservative side of things. So is it fair to say that you're a progressive Baptist pastor, or would you again try to defy the label a little bit?
I will say this theologically, I'm not as conservative as Southern Baptists are. I'm totally fine with women in ministry. My church is basically run by women at this point. If we didn't have women in my church leading, we wouldn't have a church right now. So I guess I'm very pragmatic in that respect. So I bristle at calling, like I'm a liberal Christian, right? Because orthodoxy is wide, like little o orthodoxy is wide in terms of what people can believe about things from liberals to conservatives. I'm ecumenical, right? And I'm cool with Orthodox Christians. My wife's Catholic. I have a lot of friends who are on the evangelical spectrum. I also have a huge audience with atheists and agnostics. So I am what I am. I don't try to convince people that they're wrong and I'm right. I just try to show them the data, try to be a neutral observer, right? Just a fact finder and a fact giver. And so when it comes to theology, I would say I'm not as conservative as Southern Baptists, but I'm definitely more conservative on certain issues than maybe Episcopalians or United Church of Christ, right? So somewhere in the middle, I think, which will label me as a heretic by some groups, unfortunately, on the far right. But I'm willing to live with that. I mean, that's okay for me because I like to see both sides, and I don't want to be an extremist either way.
So then let's dive right into this data, because there is a
Sure.
lot of it, and this is
Yeah.
a fascinating discussion and topic to kind of explicate. You have talked extensively about what has been called the nuns in
Mm-hmm.
America, this
Yeah.
group of individuals who are neither considering themselves maybe members of a faith group, nor are they maybe explicitly affiliating themselves as atheists. I think they're just kind of maybe somewhere in the middle.
Mm-hmm.
Talk a little bit about the rise of that, what the data shows to you,
Yep.
and what you have kind of been noticing in terms of the trends on that. Where did that even begin?
So the reason I'm probably talking to you right now is because of a graph I tweeted out about a year ago. This instrument called the General Social Survey came out, the newest wave of it. Comes out every 2 years. They're actually going to put it in the field in a couple months. And it comes out 2016, 2018, 2000. And I saw when I was at work that day, I was teaching all day. I was just scrolling Twitter between class, and I see that some of my friends are just knocking out all these graphs with the new wave of the GSS that just got released that morning. And I was like, oh, I know what I want to do with that. I want to look at the change in religious demography over the last 2 years, right? So when I get home that day, I download the GSS. I have all my code all ready to go because I keep a repository of all this code. And so I put my kids in the bath. I ran downstairs real quick and I ran this statistical analysis looking at what had happened in the last 2 years. And I saw for the first time that the nuns were now the same size statistically as evangelicals and Roman Catholics. Which is they've had this upward trajectory for a long, long time. We've all projected that it's going to happen at some point, and that time was then. And so I threw together a really quick graph, labeled it real quick, wrote a quick tweet, and I remember big news is what the first two words I put on that tweet. And then I hit tweet, and I ran back upstairs, got my kids out of the bath, got them dried off, brushed their teeth, got jammies on, and got them in bed. And I looked down at my phone, and I already had like 15 retweets in the first 10 minutes. And then it just took off from there. It got retweeted over 1,000 times. It was on the front page of Reddit with like 20,000 upvotes. Sam Harris, the famous atheist, tweeted it out. I mean, it just had this life, had these legs, and went on and on and on. And my Twitter followers doubled overnight. And then I sort of became like this, and CNN called. I was on C-SPAN. Like everyone started calling and wanting to know about these nuns, right? Like that sort of became like what I was known for. It became my brand. So the nuns, N-O-N-E-S. When I say nuns, I don't mean the ladies.
Yes, let's absolutely
Yeah.
unpack this.
Yeah.
What
Yep.
is a nun? Because you
Yep.
mentioned Sam Harris, famous
Yep.
atheist. So, I
Sure.
mean, a nun isn't necessarily just an atheist
No.
or an anti-theist.
Yep.
I mean, what is a nun?
So a nun is three categories. Okay, so there's the Pew style survey question, which is the one I prefer. They'll ask you, what's your present religion? Then it'll give you all these options ranging from, it goes Protestant, Catholic, Mormon, Orthodox, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, and then the last three options are atheist, agnostic, or nothing in particular. Okay, so those three groups together for us, we count as the nuns: atheist, agnostics, nothing in particular. Now, let's talk about each of those groups kind of individually a little bit. Okay, atheists, we all know what atheists are. They're Sam Harris's, your Richard Dawkins. They are an interesting group because they are the most disliked group in America today. People like Congress more than they like atheists.
What is the approval rating for atheists then, I guess?
So we do what's called a thermometer score, which is where we ask people to rate groups on a scale from 0, meaning very cold, to 100, meaning very warm. And atheists score about 35. Okay, so
Wow.
like that's the lowest that you can get. And it actually doesn't vary that much by partisanship. Democrats rate them really low as well as Republicans do. So this is sort of an across the board thing, like an anti-atheist look. Now, they are about 6% of the population. Okay. Now, the group, when I think of it as a continuum. They're far to the left. They're actually the most liberal group in America, they do politically. Like they identify as liberal at the highest rate. So the next group is agnostics. Okay. And they're also about 6% of the population. Agnostics are people who think there might be God, but we can never figure out what God is, right? That it's not knowable. They are sort of like, I call them like atheist light, because they're not as militant, they're not as dogmatic oftentimes as atheists are. But a lot of people who are agnostics become atheists over time because it's sort of like a scale, right? Now, so that's 6% plus 6%.
Well, Dr. Burge, before we get to the nuns, briefly on the atheist and the agnostic side, is it fair to say that both of those groups, so 6 and 6%, 12% of the population, they've thought about this intellectually. They've kind of decided that they're atheists or agnostics. They haven't slid into that. Is that fair to say?
Well, I mean, when we ask you the question on the survey, that's what you say you are. So from a social science perspective, like when people tell you who they are, believe them, right? So this is key though, and this is a good point.
Yes.
It's not about what you believe; it's about what you say you are.
Right.
So there are some atheists who say they still believe in God at some level. Okay, so it's not about what you believe in your head, or even some atheists go to church. People are blown away by that. Like 10% of atheists go to church. It's how you orient yourself in social space. That's what's key to me as a social scientist.
Right.
You taking on the moniker of atheist, that is taking on all the things that implies, right? Like that means that you are willing to be disliked by lots of Americans, right?
Yes.
So that means something. From you want to know who people like you are. Then if you say you're an atheist and those people are like you, right? Like that's my crew. Like those are how do they vote? How do they think? So that's atheist agnostics. Now,
but agnostics, though, I mean, just to clean that up, agnostics are not just anybody that would say they have doubts about God, because that would surely be more than 6%. It's people that self-identify as agnostics, to just drill on that point. But before you get to the nuns, because I think that's very interesting that you have self-identifying people within that group, and then you talk about the nuns, Dr. Burge.
Yeah. So the last group, and this is the most important group in America that no one talks. That's actually what I tweeted about today. Was a group called Nothing in Particular. And I don't know why this doesn't get more coverage in this world, because they are 20% of the American population. They're literally the largest group, religious in quotation marks, obviously, religious group in America today. There are more Nothing in Particulars than there are Roman Catholics. Like they are huge. 1 out of 5 Americans is Nothing in Particular. And what's even more fascinating is 10 years ago, they were 15% of America, and today they're 20% of America. 1 out of 20 Americans is Nothing Particular today that wasn't just a decade ago. They are the fastest growing religious group in America today, the Nothing in Particular group. Now, why are they interested? A couple of reasons. One, they have very low levels of education. They are besides Black Protestants, they are the least educated. Only 22% of them have a college degree. It's 46% of atheists and 43% of agnostics. So they're a completely different type of nun than an atheist or agnostic. I always say when they're asked the question, the Nothing in Particular group just shrugs. When they're asked what they are, they're like, I don't know. Like I'm not a Protestant, I'm not a Catholic, but I'm not an atheist either. I'm just like I don't think about religion, right? And so they have very low incomes. They have some of the lowest incomes of any group in America today. They also engage in politics at incredibly low rates. Things like voting, things like putting up yard signs, going into political meetings. So the way I think about them is they are the most checked out people in American society because they don't go to church, they don't vote, they don't get involved in politics. They probably some of them try to go to college and dropped out. So they're sort of disconnected from all the sort of social institutions that hold us together as a society, and they're growing larger by the year. And they're going to they're not organized. I mean, that's the thing. They're not organized because how do you organize a group that just shrugs at questions like that? So I think that we need to, so together, 6%, 19.5%, about 31% of Americans today are nones, N-O-N-E-S.
And so for context, Dr. Burge, percentage-wise, you've got 32% nuns, and then how many percent Catholics, how many percent Protestant, how many percent other?
Yep. So the Catholic Church is about 20% as well. So really close to the same size, between 18 and 20%, depending on how you ask the question. Protestants are difficult because we divide them up into different types of Protestants. It's important to say, though, 60% of all Americans are still Christians. That's Orthodox, Catholic, or Protestant, right? About 8 to 10% are other religious groups, though, right? So those are like people like Hindus, Buddhists, Muslims, Wiccans,
Jews.
Jews, yes, Jedis. Like everybody else, we sort of like throw in this category like potpourri because we don't know what to do with them because we don't have enough of them to like do anything with them statistically, right? So if you think of America, I think of 60% Christian, 10% other faith groups, and 30% no religion or nones.
But the nones are larger than any one Christian bloc.
Yep.
And they're certainly larger than the potpourri, the smaller groups.
Yes.
And and it's growing. So let's talk about that. It's growing. I will reference Dr. Burge, a paper that was written in 2000. Let's see. I think this was written in 2015 in the American Journal of Sociology. I'm going to briefly read this. It's by David Vos at the University College London and Mark Chaves, Duke University. I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's called, Is the United States a Counterexample to the Secularization Thesis? And here is the abstract. It's fairly short. Virtually every discussion of secularization asserts that high levels of religiosity in the United States make it a decisive counterexample to the claim that modern societies are prone to secularization. Focusing on trends rather than levels, we maintain that for two straightforward empirical reasons, the U.S. should no longer be considered a counterexample. First, it has become clear that American religiosity has been declining for decades. Second, this decline has been produced by the generational patterns underlying religious decline elsewhere in the West. Each successive cohort is less religious than the preceding one. The United States is not an exception. These findings change the theoretical import of the U.S. for debates about secularization. And obviously, Dr. Burge, this dovetails very well with what you're talking about. So with the nones, it does seem that the data would show that it is an increasing trend. And as this paper posits, each successive generation perhaps is more so. Could you unpack that and talk a little bit about that and then the conclusions raised by these authors?
Oh my goodness, I could talk about this for weeks. I mean, this idea launches 1,000 different like rabbit trails in my head about.
Well, just pick the first one and let's go. This is
okay. So first and foremost, that article, that Vos and Chaves article, has actually been back and forth with Landon Schnabel and Sean Beck about their measures and all this kind of stuff. So there's like a methodological piece to this whole thing. I don't want to get into it because it gets kind of boring, but I will say this. So the clear evidence I see in the data is that America is becoming more secular, but also more religious all at the same time. The people that are left in America who are still religious are now intensely religious. Okay. If you break the data down, if you look at all of America, which we just talked about the nones, if you look at all of America, you see like things like church attendance is way down. Biblical literalism is way down. All these measures of orthodoxy are way down. But if you exclude the nones from the group and just look at Christians, the rate of if you take the nones out, the share of Americans who attend church weekly has dropped 2% in 40 years. Right. So if you exclude those people, America is the people who are there. Right. They're not, moderate, middle of the road Christians. Like they're there every Sunday. Literalism, if you take the nones out, literalism has not declined at all in America in the last 30 years.
So Dr. Burge, literalism, I'm sorry, just for
Yeah,
anybody that might be not familiar, literalism,
yeah.
you're saying people take the Bible literally, word
Yes,
for
there's a
word.
question on the GSS that asks, what's your view of the Bible? And it gives you three options. One is the Bible should be taken literally true, word for word. Second is the Bible is inspired by God, but should not be taken word for word. And the third is the Bible is a book of fairy tales, fables, and histories that was written by men, right? So literalism, you pick number one, which is we consider to be like Orthodox or conservative Orthodox Christianity, right? Like that's what most Southern Baptists believe and a lot of more conservative Christians believe. So that share of Americans is exactly the same today as it was 30 years ago, right? If you take the nuns out. So the people who are there have not become more liberal, and actually in some ways they become more conservative. They're at least as conservative and as active today as they were 30 years ago. So what we're seeing then is religious polarization, okay, which is, and I have this graph where I show the share. This is what a lot of people don't realize. They don't realize the other side of it. So I just talked about the nuns, right? They were 5% in 1978. They are 23% today using the GSS measure, which I think actually undercounts the nuns. But, and this is what people don't realize, the share of Americans who identify as born again has never been higher than it is today. 41% of Americans claim a born again identity. So now, on the one side, the nuns are getting larger. On the other side, the born agains are getting larger. It used to be that 55% of Americans were neither nun nor born again. 55%. In 2018, it was 35%. So now the share of people in the middle has almost gotten cut in half. And I bet you in another 10 years, it will be cut in half from what it was in 1978. So what we're seeing is religious polarization. Either you're very religious, very evangelical, go to church all the time, or you are completely away from religion. There's like that polite Christianity that used to exist where you went to church once or twice a month and you kind of believe this stuff, but you weren't going to like pound the pulpit and go to hell and all that stuff, right? Those kind of people are lost in America today. And I think a lot of them, and the data actually backs this up, a lot of them have become religiously unaffiliated because American Christianity has gotten more, the message has gotten tighter and the orthodoxy has gotten smaller. And a lot of mainline Protestants got tired of being called heretics by evangelicals saying, you don't believe what we believe, so you're out. Yeah, we don't think you're a Christian.
Many potential questions there, but let me
Sure.
ask something that stuck out to me. You mentioned 41% born again, and that would
Mm-hmm.
seem to overlap with the Christians that would consider themselves Catholic, Orthodox, Anglican. So
Mm-hmm.
are you saying that there's a mixing of labels, that basically everyone who's hardcore, they're
Mm-hmm.
seriously religious, they're getting lumped into kind of one big category, or how does that
They
shake out?
self-identify. I mean, that we asked the question on the GSS. It says, "Have you had a born again experience as a significant moment in your life where you turn towards Jesus Christ?" And the share of Catholics who say that is as high as it's ever. Actually, it's higher than it's ever been now. And I actually wrote this piece from our website. It's called "The Curious Case of Born Again Catholics." And I tried to figure out why. Like, why are more Catholics identifying with born again? And the best that I can ascertain is it's born again has become like sort of this, it's lost its sort of theological specificity. And basically what it means now for most Americans is it means like really religious, right? Like it's a way to like express your devoutness, no matter whether you're Orthodox or Catholic or Protestant. You say, I'm born again, which means I'm really doing this. Like I had a real, this church matters to me a lot. So I think it's sort of, the term has lost from a theologian standpoint. Like, you can't be Catholic and born again. Like that's not a thing theologically. But people go, yeah, but I'm like those evangelicals. I go to church all the time and I pray and I give to the church. So they adopt the born again label. So it becomes sort of a shortcut for very religious or very devout.
So in terms of the people that are attending church weekly, and you say that's only dropped 2%
Mm-hmm.
over a long period of time, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
what is the total number of Americans in terms of X number millions of Americans? That's what you're talking about? Or are you talking about as a relative share
Yeah.
of the Christian population? I mean, in real
Yeah.
numbers, what does that look like?
Yeah. So I always think in terms of percentages, because I was thinking of surveys and the survey sample, so percentage size. About 32% of Americans who, if you exclude the nuns, okay, so people who are still identifying with a religion, about 32% of them still attend church nearly once a week or more. Which is, that's a significant chunk of Americans, right? So if you consider that 75% of Americans and then 30% of 75, about 20 to 25% of Americans, and there's 330 million Americans. So you're talking about 65 million people go to church once a week in America today, which is I mean, it's a lot in some ways, but it's not a lot in other ways. I mean, considering how many people live in this country, but it's clear that we are from OECD nations, industrialized first world countries. We are the most devout religiously. I mean, most of Europe is in the single digits, 5, 10% go to church once a week. So we are much more religious than Europe is. And, to go back to the secularization idea, let's go back to that for a
Yeah,
second.
so Voss and Chaves, I mean,
Yep.
the first point they make is American religiosity has been declining for decades. They state that emphatically.
Hmm.
Do you agree with that statement?
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't not just you can't. It's hard if you look at the data every day. You can't make a counter argument, right? Which is that America has more and more nuns. Now, I will put some nuance on that. Okay, I don't know if that's actually what's happening. If more and more people are becoming nuns, or if more and more people are just saying what they already are. So there's this idea in survey research called social desirability bias, and it's the long and the short of it is people lie on surveys, and they lie about stuff that might make them look bad in the eyes of the person that's interviewing them. So things like drug use, things like sexual partners, things like racism or sexism, huge areas where people lie. But another area where people lie is church attendance, because in America, church attendance is still seen as something to aspire yourself to, seen as a good thing. So we think that people are overinflating, they were at least overinflating their religiosity, the religious tradition they were part of, and how often they went to church. But here's what we think happened. As more and more people came out and the nuns got larger and larger, it sort of gave more permission for more people to say what they actually were on surveys, because the stigma went down when the share of the population went up. And so as the nuns rose, that sort of fed on itself, and more people go, well, heck, 20% of Americans are nuns. I mean, that's a huge chunk. I can be a nun too. So they're actually not, nothing's really, it's hard to look at this empirically, but it's just a theory that what's actually happened was people were always nuns. They just lied about it a bunch back in the day. And now they're just being honest. So really what we're seeing today is the true religiosity of America, and not some socially desirable version of America we saw 30 years ago.
But Dr. Burge, isn't it so that there is a stratification by age group on this question? And
Mm-hmm.
would you say that that points to maybe a decline in religiosity? And
Yeah.
could you talk about that? Because I've seen the data, but I can't cite it immediately. So maybe
Mm-hmm.
you can give us the
Yeah.
data.
So, yes, every successive generation is less religious than the prior generation. And that's been true going as far back as we have data, going back to people even born in the early 1900s. Okay. So every generation has been less religious. And on top of that, when they came into the workforce at 18 years old, they were less religious than the prior generation. And then they became less religious over time. I mean, there are more boomers who are nuns today than there were boomers who were nuns 30 years ago. So even
Really?
yeah,
The same people.
yes, absolutely. Yes.
So that's indicating that they're dropping out or
Mhm.
perhaps re-identifying themselves, as you say, over time.
Exactly. So there's this thing called the life cycle effect, which I honestly think empirically is not true, but it makes a lot of sense theoretically. So I'll just pitch it out there. The idea is that when you are young, you go to church because your parents make you go to church, and it's social and it's fun. Your friends are there, youth group, all that stuff. Then you go away to college and you get into a new environment with people you don't know, and you hear new ideas, and you want to rebel anyway, because that's what you do when you're 18, 19, 20. So you go away to college, and what do? Well, you sort of drift away from religion. And, for practical reasons and theological reasons, you just do that because you're trying to find your own way, make your own faith, whatever. And then you get married, you have kids, you settle down. And what do you want to do? Well, you want your kids to have the same religious upbringing that you did when you were a kid. So what do? You put them back in church. And so you start going back to church as well. So we sort of see this, this trough in the early 20s, late teens, early 20s, and then late 20s, we should see that your attendance go back up as you get back into church with your kids. And then maybe it goes down over time because your kids grow up and leave the house or whatever. The reality is that's not happening at all for the youngest generations. Gen X and millennials, they do not see that peak and trough. They do not come back to church once they leave. When they leave, they're gone and they don't come back. So if you look, though, at each successive generation, about 40% of millennials today, which is what I am. I'm an older millennial. People don't realize there's millennial grandparents, by the way. I'm 38 years old. So, millennials are old now. We're not kids. 40% of millennials are nuns, 40%. But here's what's interesting. Gen Z, which are the oldest members of Gen Z now, are 25 years old. Okay, so we don't have a ton of them in the sample yet because they haven't aged into surveys.
So Gen Z, I mean, just to put this in perspective, Gen Z, the oldest
Yeah.
members would have been born in 1995. 5, I think there's a book I read not too long ago called iGen, I think about the same generation.
Yes.
And it
Yes.
basically people that they would have grown up in their formative teen years, smartphones had already come
Hmm.
out and
Yep.
so on and so forth. So, okay, so Gen Z, 25 years old. What about Gen Z, Dr.
Gen Z is 40% nuns as well. They have not gone up from where millennials are right now.
Okay, so but
That,
they're also at 40%. So you're saying
yes.
millennials and then younger are at this
Yes.
40% figure, which
Hmm.
includes the religious nuns as well as the atheists and agnostics,
That's
or is
right.
that just the
But
nuns?
what's
Yeah.
interesting is they're not going up from where the millennials are, though, which is
Okay.
sort of fascinating. We would expect them to continue this rise, and there is some evidence now that's starting to creep out that's saying that we've sort of hit this plateau of the nuns. Like they've been rising, 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 and then the most recent survey data I've seen is they kind of they peaked out around 40%. Like that's what Gen Z is going to be. That's what millennials are, and maybe that's the natural top. Like maybe 60% theistic, 40% nuns is what America's going to look like in 30 or 40 years. We're not there yet, obviously, because all these people have to age through and boomers have to die off. But that might be, I mean, that's something, I don't know if that's good news or not, but we thought, it's an exponential rise, right? It'll never stop. It goes up and up and up and up, but we've seen this plateau. So there actually might be something in the data we haven't seen yet that's causing this to stop.
Well, Dr. Burge, I mean, based on what you said earlier, though, you said, well, in Europe, you have countries where there's a very, very small percentage of church attendance. I mean, immediately to mind for me comes the Czech Republic. I don't remember the exact numbers. I'm sure you know, but the Czech Republic has a very, very high rate of actually, I think, self-declared atheism, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And what are those numbers, by the way? Do you know?
So I don't know about Czech Republic specifically, but I do know that Eastern Bloc countries are fascinating because they're not all the same. For instance,
Right, some are
Poland.
different. Yeah, so
Yeah.
some of those countries, though, in Europe do have a very, very low rate of weekly church attendance, and obviously a lot of
Yes.
churches closing. And so, if it's 5 to 10% or something like that, as you said, I mean,
Yeah.
why wouldn't you say that at some point America would simply move towards that kind
Yeah.
of norm? I mean, you're suggesting that it's going to stay at 40%
Mm-hmm.
nuns for 30 to 40 years, but
Yeah.
that hasn't been the trend in the recent past.
I think that, and this is hard to do empirically because we can't, I mean, America's a unique case, right? You have to, I mean, I was a history undergrad, so I can't dig like deep into European history, but besides telling you that a lot of European history is religious wars, right? Catholics versus Protestants, Muslim versus Christianity. A lot of the conflict in Europe, the church became a political actor to its own detriment, I think. Right, popes took on this political power they probably shouldn't have had, and for Europeans, religion was more cultural than it was theological. Right, so when they walked away from religion, they walked away from the the cultural piece of it. They don't mind the theology. Most people still believe in God, by the way. 90% of people still believe in God in America, even though the nuns are now 25-30%. That's not that piece. It's the piece where they don't like the institution of the church. Now, American church has been different, though, because we haven't fought any religious wars in America like Europeans did. I do think that same idea is in America, but also we have to understand America is stubbornly religious. We have always been more religious than other countries around us. We're always probably going to be more religious. That's why it's hard to use Europe as an example, because we are from Europe, most of us, but that doesn't mean we have the same viewpoint as Europeans do, because our history is not the same. And we don't have state churches in America. And most European countries still to this day in Germany still have state-supported churches, for goodness sakes. So the link is completely different in Europe in religion compared to America in religion. And I just think that we are just a persistently religious country. Despite all the other things that have happened, Americans still believe in God. A lot of them still go to church. And I don't think we're ever going to get to the levels of European secularization. I just don't see that happening.
By the way, Dr. Burge, I looked it up. It's 80% in the Czech Republic are either undeclared or atheist, and so it certainly is a higher level, obviously, than America. But you're suggesting that there are factors that are different. I want to bring to light and get your comment on an idea that has been somewhat discussed among religion scholars and journalists, those commenting as you do, the idea called moralistic therapeutic deism.
Yeah, Christian Smith. Yeah.
So this comes from sociologists Christian Smith and Melinda Denton, and they did a study among teenagers. I think they interviewed several thousand, and this is what they found to be a common set of beliefs among teenagers, just citing kind of here from their study. A God exists who created and ordered the world and watches over human life on earth. God wants people to be good, nice, and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and by most world religions. The central goal of life is to be happy and to feel good about oneself. God does not need to be particularly involved in one's life, except when God is needed to resolve a problem. And then the last one, good people go to heaven when they die. And obviously, if that is a correct thesis, that this is something that is very commonplace, that is certainly, it's maybe a Judeo-Christian flavor, although one could perhaps say it takes from many different religious traditions. What is your comment on that book, The Concept of Moralistic Therapeutic Deism?
Yeah, I think a lot of my evangelical friends begrudge the fact that most Americans don't have a coherent theology of the world. They don't have a clear way of looking at things. People like God becomes this guy that you pray to when bad things happen, right? If you look at polling data, over 90% of Americans believe in heaven, but only about 55% of Americans believe in hell, which tells you something, right? Like, we don't like the idea of punishment. It's the people who get on TV, the religious people who get on TV, oftentimes are a little bit, zealous. They're a little bit, they have a very specific orthodoxy they believe in. Most Americans don't believe in that. Like, most Americans don't like this whole idea of like narrow gate, ask, seek, knock, on the way, the truth, and the life. Most Americans, even most Christians, don't believe that. Most Americans believe like, do good, be good. Religion helps me be good. But if you don't believe what I believe, that's fine. Am I going to go to hell? I don't know. Not my place to judge. And that's what Christian Smith's talking about in that book, right? Most Americans do not, even adults, even people who go to church every Sunday, if you really press them on things like omnipotence and omniscience and, the fallibility of God and all these kind of things, they don't have a coherent theology of that. And I don't want to cast aspersions on anybody, but I'll just say this. The fastest growing churches in America are not going through catechism. Okay. They're not doing deep dives into, St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine's theology, right? They're not going into Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They're not talking about John Calvin and John Wesley, right? They're talking about 4 ways to be a better husband or 3 ways to be a better parent, right? That's the kind of theology that comes out in churches: do good, be good. And you know what? The churches that teach those other things, those more theological things, are not growing. And I think one of the reasons is because they make it easy at non-denominational churches and mega churches by being so simplistic, right? And that's what people want. They want encouraged, they want community, they want inspired. And honestly, that doesn't create a coherent theology.
So, Dr. Burge, are you saying you do agree with the concept that this moralistic therapeutic deism, as it's called by Smith and Denton, I mean, do you agree with that concept, that has become a primary belief system among
Yeah.
people of a Judeo-Christian mindset? Or
Oh yeah. I mean, if I can, and there's, like I said, there's tons of data about like, do you believe your religion's like the exclusive way to heaven? Most people say no, right?
Well, so let's unpack a little bit, because you mentioned, okay, you say the fastest growing churches don't have catechism, and yet you
Yep.
also said weekly church attendance has basically been stable, and yet the nuns are increasing. So
Yep.
one might deduce from this data that you lay out on the table, that while perhaps nominal church attendance is remaining constant, the actual engagement with maybe the details of religion and knowledge about religion itself perhaps is declining. Is that a fair statement, or could you perhaps talk about where you feel like that maybe is occurring or not occurring?
Yeah. The one thing that I'm always confronted with, and this is what all political science graduate students are confronted with at some point, is realizing that most Americans, it's amazing that democracy still works in America. Based on how little people know about how democracy works in America. You ask them basic civics questions. There's this book by Della Carpini and Keeter, came out in 1996. They basically asked people 5 questions about politics, 2 easies, 2 mediums, and a hard. And the average person got 2 of them right. Less than half of Americans got more than 2 of them right. On religious knowledge questions, we did the same thing. We asked some really basic questions about like, who took the 10 Commandments down from Mount Sinai, right? Not difficult stuff. How many disciples did Jesus have? And over half of Americans can't get those questions right, even people who say they're Christians and even people who go to church frequently, right? So there's a lot of, it doesn't get down into their heads, right? It doesn't get rooted deeply in who they are and how they think about the world. Like churches are really bad. And I talk to my friends all the time. I have friends who are pastors, including myself, and they'll say, I can't talk about politics from the pulpit. And I say, that's great. That's fine. You shouldn't talk about politics in the pulpit, but you have to understand, you need to teach people how to think about the world and how to have a worldview, especially in my case, a Christian worldview. How would Jesus think about this,
But
right?
Pastor, but let me ask you though: is that phenomenon of
Yeah.
the of maybe people not knowing, let's say, how many disciples there are, and I mean
Yeah.
that seems like knowledge that most people would probably have. I certainly
Yeah.
think most people listening to this probably know, but then not everybody listens to podcasts with, Dr. Ryan Burge and then some guy in Houston. So I mean, but if let's say that is there,
Yeah.
is that getting worse? Is general knowledge about one's religion getting worse? I mean, in at least among Christians and those attending church weekly.
I think it is, and here's how I think it is. I don't know this for sure, but here's the proxy I would use. The churches that taught catechism and still teach catechism are mainline Protestant churches, things like the Episcopal Church, the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, the United Methodist Church. And what I know is that mainline Protestant Christianity, this is like a great fact about American religious demography. In 1976, 30.9% of Americans were mainline Protestants. There's never been a tradition in America the last 46 years that got over 30% except mainline Protestants. Evangelicals have never gotten that large, okay? 30.9% of Americans were mainline Protestants in 1976.
Mainline Protestants, you're saying, so just to
Yeah.
define that,
Yeah.
Methodists.
Episcopalians, United Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ, American Baptists, like what I am,
Okay.
United Methodist Church. Those are sort of your more moderate forms of American Protestant Christianity.
Okay.
30.9% in 1976. In 2018, they are 10.5%.
Wow.
Yeah, I projected that in the next 10 years, they'll be 5%. They are also the oldest tradition in America. The average mainline Protestant today is over 60 years old, which means in 20 years, half of them are going to be dead. So, I mean, that was a tradition that was the dominant Protestant flavor of Christianity. And those are the traditions where you had to go through catechism to become a member of the church. They actually had to learn stuff about the church. Now, there are other churches like non-denominational churches, Southern Baptist churches, who have a very low view of things like catechism. If you feel the Spirit calling you, whether you know who Jesus is or don't, know how many disciples there are or not, you can walk up on Sunday morning, get baptized, and become a member of the church that day without any sort of theological training or education, right? And those are the churches that are growing. So I think that by itself would show you that the overall level of religious knowledge in America has gone down because the mainline tradition has declined so rapidly.
So, Dr. Burge, do you have any data, or is there any data showing the stickiness or the retention among individuals in the different traditions, people that maybe become Catholic versus they go to a Pentecostal versus a Southern Baptist or a Methodist church? Let's say you have somebody that converts in college, or 25 or 30, as you say, they have kids, and then they maybe decide to go back to church. I mean, where is it that they are likely to keep going to church until they are, retirement age, and where maybe will they, I mean, what does the data show on that, or is there data on that?
Yeah. Oh yeah. So the General Social Survey asked the question, what was your religion growing up? And they asked what your religion is today. So we can use those questions to sort of look at things like retention. So for instance, in the 1970s, 96.6% of people who were raised evangelical stayed evangelical. Today, in the 2010s, it's still 89.3%. So very good retention. Only 1 in 10 people raised evangelical leave the evangelical tradition as adults. For mainlines, it went from 87% to 68%.
Wow.
So almost 1 in 3 mainliners left that tradition as adults. For Catholics, it went from 88% to 70%. So,
wow.
So 3 in 10 people raised Catholic are not Catholic any longer. And here's what's super interesting. People who are raised with no religion. Now, that used to not even be a thing because there were not that many nuns to raise people. But in the 1970s, about 1 in 3 people raised a nun stayed a nun as an adult, which means 2 out of 3 people went back to religion, left religion.
Wow.
Yeah. But today, it's the opposite of that. Now it's 2/3 of people raise nuns, stay nuns, and it's going up every decade, which means the nuns is becoming a tradition in America where people are raised in it and stay with it. And we're going to see, and we've actually already starting to see this, 2nd and 3rd generation nun families in America on a large scale. And we have no concept of what that looks like because it's never happened before.
So, Dr. Burge, I mean, you mentioned, I mean, this was just the discussion we were having about, is America going to stay constantly at like 40% nun, or is it going to be, a greater? I mean, it would seem like, based on the notion of multi-generational families that have no religious tradition at all, that would only increase. Is that not so, or is there a reason to believe that wouldn't happen?
I think what's going to happen is the evangelical families, by and large, are going to do a better job at keeping the evangelical kids in the evangelical tradition. They're still doing a great job. Like 90% of people still stay.
Right.
But as the nuns get larger, they're going to become stickier. It's going to become a recognized thing to be a nun, right? I was raised that way. I'll stay that way. So I think what we're going to see is the nuns are going to they're not going to lose people as fast. That's one of the reasons the nuns haven't grown larger, by the way, because 1 in 3 people raised nuns goes back to religion. So if they all stayed as nuns, the number of nuns would be even larger than it is right now. So here's the thing I worry about, though. The Catholic Church is really, really problematic because, and this is a graph I tweeted out the other day that got a lot of people fired up. It showed that the share of Catholics who go to church every week has dropped in half in the last 40 years.
Wow.
45% in 1972. Now it's 25% today.
Of a smaller 25% of a smaller group of Catholics.
No. That's the crazy thing. It's the same. The Catholic Church is the same. Over the last 46 years, the Catholic Church is basically the same size today.
Same size. Okay.
Yeah.
So it has
no difference there.
Okay.
So that's what a lot of people ask me. Isn't it just because there are fewer people there or whatever,
Right.
it is? No. Catholic Church is the same size it was 40 years ago. It's just the share of Catholics who go to church every Sunday has declined almost in half in the last 46 years, which is for evangelicals. You know what the change is? No change. Actually, it's gone up a little bit. The share that go weekly of evangelicals has gone up. Mainliners has gone up. Black Protestants stayed flat. Catholics dropped in half. And that is, I think, tied up in this idea of cultural Catholicism. You know, people are Catholic by name only. They were raised Catholic, like that term raised Catholic, cradle Catholic. That doesn't happen in evangelicalism or other Protestant traditions, right? People don't, it's not a culture thing. It's really a religious identity. And so a lot of people identify as Catholics, but really are nuns. Or are leaning, towards that direction, it seems like.
So on Catholicism, recently I interviewed Bishop David Conderla, the Bishop of Tulsa, Oklahoma, who led a very strong outreach parish in a college town in Texas before he became the Bishop of Tulsa. And he talked a lot about catechism and trying to bring people into the church. Would it be fair to say that if a person who's Catholic is identifying in a cultural way as opposed to actually actively attending, are they less likely to have the next generation remain Catholic, or would you say that the affiliation is going to continue?
Data on that's very hard because we have to ask questions over a long period of time and ask people about how much their parents went to church, for instance, and those questions really don't exist. But what we do know is the more attached your parents are, the more likely you are to go because that's just you get raised up in a certain kind of way. Now, I will say this, and we don't have real good data on this just yet, but there's something that happens with kids who are raised in church and go oftentimes. Most of them stay in that tradition for their entire lives, but there's a good amount of rebellion that goes on there. And we really don't understand those mechanisms well enough at this point to understand what causes some kids to sort of, buy into it all the way, and then some kids sort of rebel against that as they grow up.
Interesting. So there's not a whole lot of research on why some kids just kind of peel off. And
No, I mean, and that's really hard to do empirically because, the only way to do it really is do interviews. And interviews are great. Like I have a lot of friends who do interviews as part of their research. It's just hard to come up with systematic overarching themes out of 100 interviews, let's say, because everyone's faith journey is completely unique from everybody else's. The reason they left, and this is what I was describing political science, we have to try to figure out what goes on in someone's head when they push a button in a voting booth on a November every 4 years. And it could be, I disagree with his monetary policy, but it could be, I don't like his haircut, right? and both those things matter when you go push the button. With religion, it could be a pastor said something in a sermon one time I didn't like, or it could be I was assaulted by a member of the staff and no one came and helped me.
Oh, wow.
It could be something very very meaningful and very systematic, but it could be something so flippant and so idiosyncratic that we can't make, that's not a trend, right? Like, so that's why it's hard to take all these stories and then make them into some sort of overarching trend that we can tell this is why people are leaving church, because it's not one reason, it's 1,000 reasons. And for everybody, it's a little bit different.
So Dr. Burge, you had mentioned that, there are certain retention rates that we know. You said it's 90% among evangelicals, it's about 70% among Catholics, it's a little less than 70 among mainline denominations and so forth. What is the fate of that remaining, let's say 30% of mainline Protestants or Catholics, or 10 or so percent of evangelicals who don't remain in the faith tradition of their parents? Do they become a different Christian tradition? Do they become a different religion altogether? Do they become nuns or atheists or agnostics?
So when evangelicals leave, almost all of them become nuns. Almost all. Like not so. In the 2010s, 89.3% of people raised evangelical stayed evangelical, but then 10.5% of the people who were raised evangelical became nuns, that's all but 0.2%. So basically, they all become nuns who leave evangelical. For mainline, they go one of two ways: they either become an evangelical or they become a nun. And actually, it's pretty evenly split about where they go. So about 13% become evangelical, about 18% become a nun. For Catholics, interestingly enough, 17.1% of Catholics became nuns as adults, but then 8.7% became evangelicals as adults. So you do see some movement back towards evangelicalism. And the no religion group is super interesting because, like I said, 2/3 stay nuns, no religion. But the people who leave really is a nice smattering of evangelical, mainline, Catholic, and other faiths. So they kind of go all different traditions when nuns leave the nun faith. They don't go back necessarily to Christianity either. A good chunk go back and become Buddhists or, Muslims or something like that.
And I do want to talk about other faiths, but I just have a couple more questions about the nuns because this is really interesting, Dr. Burge.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned earlier that the nuns tend to be socioeconomically perhaps a little bit lower on the totem pole than other groups in terms of maybe being less educated,
Yep.
less well off economically. Where are the nuns? I mean, if you were going to pinpoint them, if you're going to say they tend to be in these communities, these,
Mm-hmm.
regions, these, city versus rural, or, I mean, if you're going to try and point out where they are, of course, it's probably that they're somewhat spread out, but where would you find nuns?
All over. I mean, when you're 20% of America, you're all over the place, right?
Okay.
You've got to be in cities and towns and rural areas and suburbs. I think the coy answer I would say is the thing is you can't see them because they're so disaffected and disconnected from American society in almost every possible way.
So it's
But
not so Dr. Burge, I mean, it might be easy for someone to just say, well, probably, those people would be more in the cities. I think there's a kind of a general feeling, oh, rural areas are more religious than cities, et cetera. But you're saying no, that's not necessarily the case.
no, I wrote a piece from a religion news service about the suburbs. And I think the suburbs have actually become the hotbed of American evangelical Christianity. If you look at some of the fastest growing churches in America, where the most prominent Protestant preachers are in America, almost all of them have churches in major metro areas or in the suburbs of major metro areas, right? So a lot of like the upwardly mobile evangelicals in America today are not rural, they're suburban and urban. But nothing in particular is, we do find more atheists and agnostics in the cities, which, kind of follows, right? That it's hard to be an atheist in Alabama, right? You don't want to be like living in a rural county in Mississippi and be an atheist because that's kind of against the culture. If you're in an urban area though, it's a lot more eclectic, right? You get people from other religious groups. Being of no religious group is totally fine. But I would say this, the nothing in particular group is not, and I know I lump them all together as nuns, but man, I don't even know, the nothing in particular group is not, they're not opposed to religion. So here's an interesting, we had what's called a panel survey, which is where we ask people every 2 years what their religious affiliation is. The same people, not different people, the same people. So we can track religious change at the individual level over time. And what's interesting is, so in 2010, this share of people said they were nothing in particular. By 2014, only 60% of those people were still nothing in particular 4 years later. And of the 40% who left and became a different tradition, 20% became atheists or agnostics, but then another 20% went back to Christianity, right? So 1 in 5 of them switched back to Christianity over time. Amongst atheists, it was 2%. So like these nothing in particulars are they're very malleable when it comes to their religious affiliation. And I think they're sort of a good mission field if churches want to look for someone to go after. Don't go yell at Sam Harris and try to convert that guy. Those atheists are not going anywhere. They know what they are and they're confident in what they are. Nothing in particulars are not antithetical to religion. They just sort of like are disconnected from religion, and they are actually receptive to hearing messages about religion much more than atheists or agnostics are.
Last question on nuns for now, Dr. Burge. So
Yep.
in the group of Christians that you talked about, the 60 or so percent of people in America who are some Christian tradition, how many of them probably could be classified as nuns, actually, if you really could dive in and figure out where they really were and where their heads were?
I'm there. Well, I mean, those are hard questions to answer, right? Because
That's
you
why
have
I'm asking it.
Yeah, no, I mean, like my methodological like brains, like my social science brain's kicking in, and it's like, what does a nun really mean? And I just published a paper where someone said, listen, to be a nun, you can't believe, you can't belong, and you can't behave. And I
Hmm.
was like, that is a ridiculous definition because that only means 7% of Americans are nuns, and that's just not true. But then if you look at just people who never go to church, it's well over 40 or 45%. Right. So
Okay,
it's
wow.
hard for me to pin down, like what is it? Do you say you're a nun? Is that what it is? Do you never go to church? Is that what it is? Do you not believe in God? Is that what it is? So when we talk about nuns, it's hard for me to pin down exactly because everyone in their own heads has a different conception of what a nun is.
Right,
Right.
right, right.
And you know what? Like from a social science perspective, I think like it doesn't bother me that people don't believe in God but still go to church. That actually makes a lot of sense to me from a social science perspective because we
Hmm.
know so there's what are called vertical versus horizontal
Hmm.
religiosity. And I think this is the thing I think most people they don't think about religion much. They come at me on Twitter going, well, how can you be an evangelical that never goes to church? Or how you can be, how can you be an atheist that does go to church? I go, listen, it's not about that. It's about the social thing, the horizontal dimension of what church provides. And you know what? A lot of people go to church and don't believe any of it. They go to church because they see their friends. It gives them an outlet to be social, it gives them something to do every week. Especially if you're older and retired, you're lonely. And church provides a built-in family for you, a support network. You get sick, who shows up? The church shows up. You need help, who shows up? The church shows up. So I think we need to stop thinking about religion entirely in this vertical space and start thinking about the horizontal aspects, which I think, as a social scientist and a pastor, are just as important as the vertical and the theological.
Very interesting. Okay, Dr. Bird. So let me pivot a little bit because I don't want to leave non-Christians out of the loop here in terms of other faith traditions. They are,
Sure.
as you say, 10% of the
Mm-hmm.
American population. Of that, what would be the largest? Probably Judaism is probably the
Mm-hmm.
largest group,
Yep.
and then maybe followed by Hinduism,
Mormons,
perhaps
Hindus,
Mormons.
Buddhists, and
Okay,
Muslims are
okay.
all sort of right, like between 1 and 1.5% of Americans, right? So they're statistically very similar in size. And people ask me these questions all the time. Like, are Muslims growing in America? The answer is I see no evidence of that in the data. They're about 1 to 1.5% in every survey that I see, which is statistically the same thing. There's really none of those groups are growing that rapidly. But I do think over time. So here's something that really is sort of projecting what America's going to look like in 20 or 30 years. The average Muslim in America today is like 27 years old, but the average mainline Protestant is 60, right? So these younger people, and we also know they have higher fertility rates. Evangelical fertility rates have dropped. Mainline Protestant fertility rates have dropped. Catholic fertility rates have dropped off the table. So what we're going to see is more and more kids are being born from Muslim, Hindu, Mormons, Buddhist families, while fewer and fewer kids are being born to evangelical families or Catholic families. So that's naturally going to sort of create this change over time where America is going to become less Christian just because of demography, not because of religious switching or conversion, just because more kids are going to be born that are Buddhist or Hindu, right? So um, here's the thing about those groups. It's really hard to know what they are statistically because there's so few of them.
Because so they're hard to measure, doctor. So I guess
Yeah.
the next question probably you can predict is, okay, so does the nun phenomenon, is it a multi-faith thing? Is it irrespective of whether you're Christian or Jewish or Muslim or Hindu? People are just becoming less religious all around the board, or is it really affecting primarily Christians?
So here's what we know. There's a question on the survey I look at that asks, what your immigration status is, whether you're an immigrant, your parents are immigrants, or you second or third generation or more immigrants. What we know is, and this is a question I get asked a lot about Hispanics, especially, because they're always interested in assimilation arguments, right? Like, are they they stick to what they are when they come here, or do they change? The answer is by the second generation. So your parents came here, immigrated here, and then you were born here. You look almost exactly like America looks like. So that means you're
Hmm.
more likely to become a nun. And then that goes up every successive generation where you're basically assimilated by the second generation of people born in this country. So they do not stay more Catholic. And there's actually some discussion about do Hispanics especially become evangelicals because like the religion of America is evangelicals. That doesn't happen either. What happens is they become nuns because America is becoming more and more nuns over time. So they want to look like America looks like. And it's much more acceptable to be religiously unaffiliated in America than as Honduras or Nicaragua or countries in Central or South America. So they become what America looks like. That's the long
So,
and
so
short.
for example, like here in Houston, obviously we have a very large immigrant population from many, many different countries, but a large Latino population, and many Protestant Latino churches, that defy maybe the notion that all Latinos are Catholic. So you're saying that by that second generation, a large number of people from really any country, they're going to begin assimilating in a similar way to the current makeup that you described, the 60-30-10 split.
Yep, pretty much. I mean, I think it's that pull though, right? When you weren't from a previous country, you don't have the tie like your parents do. So you want to become what your friends are, and more of them become nuns. And so, especially younger generations, right? 40% of millennials, 40% of Gen Z, those are the people who are going to become nuns. So there's not going to be some sort of, but here's an interesting sidebar to that. 25% of Catholics today are non-white Catholics, which is the highest it's ever been. That's a fascinating switch that's going on in the Catholic Church. Is the American Catholic Church is going to have to start respecting and understanding the fact they're getting less white every day, and almost everyone in the leadership of the Catholic Church is white. And that's going to have to change. When 2/3 of your people are white, but 1/3 are non-white, you got to start, the leadership needs to start looking like the congregations are looking. But politically, white Catholics are becoming more and more Republican over time, and non-white Catholics are actually becoming less and less Republican over time too. So there's a political split going on in the Catholic Church as well.
Oh, interesting. I do want to get to politics, but I want to ask one more question here about the other religions. So, with regards to Judaism or Islam or other religious traditions that are in that 10%, is
Yeah.
there any way to know, though, whether or not those individuals who grow up in America in those faiths, I mean, do they retain their faith at a similar level, more or less than, let's say, the average Christian, mainline, evangelical, what have you?
We don't know. I mean, because there's so few of them, like we talked about. So, like, if
Right.
I do the General Social Survey, asked the question, "What religion were you raised in?" I looked at that. There were 20 Mormons in the 2018 wave.
Oh,
So,
wow.
like, you can't do statistically. But I will say this: I have other data about Mormons, and Mormons are super interesting to me because they're really Republican. Like, they identify as the Republican Party as much as white evangelicals do, but only 55% of them voted for Donald Trump in 2016. A big chunk actually voted for Evan McMullen, because he was a Mormon, he was from Utah, and they wanted to kind of do a protest vote against Donald Trump. Almost every other religious group from 2012 to 2016 did not shift their voting choice in any meaningful way except for Mormons. They were the only group that shifted more than 5 points from 2012 to 2016 in their presidential vote choice. So that's what we do know about Mormons. They actually are conservative Republicans, but they're not across the board partisan as much as, like, let's say, white evangelicals or white Catholics are.
So I do want to dive a little into politics because
Sure.
obviously it's an election year, and this is a lot of what you talk about, Dr. Burge. But that stuff with the nuns and talking about religious breakdown, it is very interesting, and I think new, frankly, to many people that maybe are not specifically reading that topic. So, okay, with religious affiliation and political affiliation. We're going into the 2020 election. Presumptive Democratic nominee Joe Biden, obviously President Trump seeking re-election, and everyone kind of has an idea about who's going to go where. But what does the data show that you are looking at?
So it's I wish I had a cooler answer than this, but if you look at the last 3 presidential elections, 8, 12, 16, the share of white evangelicals who voted for the Republican was exactly the same. The share of white Catholics who voted for the Republican is exactly the same. The share of white mainline Protestants who voted for the Republican is exactly the same, right? American
When you
politics.
say exactly the same, like, I
Yeah.
mean, how
So
close?
about 78% of white evangelicals voted for Trump, which is exactly the same that voted for McCain in 08, which is exactly the same voted for Romney.
There were 78% in all 3 elections?
Yeah, that's like,
Wow.
people always say like 80% of white evangelicals vote for Trump. Like, that's some sort of aberration. And I'm like, that's not an aberration. That's exactly what we would predict. Like, that is what.
So it's very, very predictable, the percentage. And so do you think
Yes.
that will continue? Let's start with evangelicals. Do you think that'll continue in this election?
Yes. I don't see any reason. I mean, his approval rating, okay. So my one caveat is it's early. There's COVID. The economy's in shatter, all that stuff. Right. But I will say this, that there's some data that came up from PRRI last week that showed his approval rating amongst white evangelicals dropped 11 points in the last month. And I don't know if that's a blip or if that's a trend. Like, the COVID response is actually driving down their support. But if you look at his job approval numbers, they're very good amongst white evangelicals. They've actually gone up in some polls since they elected him in 2016. So I didn't see any weakening. Now, like I said, huge caveat. Recent data says there might be some weakening. I don't know that for sure, though. We have to look and listen. At the end of the day, partisans are going to be partisan, right?
Well, it would sound like, Dr. Burge, what you're saying is that if it's 78% 3 elections in a row,
yeah,
the trend is really more that it's 78% in a partisan direction are going to vote for the Republican candidate, regardless. I mean, you have 3 very different Republican candidates: Mitt
yeah.
Romney, John McCain, and Donald Trump.
And think about the 3 Republican candidates we just talked about. John McCain, who was not really a Christian, like a devout Christian. That wasn't his identity in any way. Mitt Romney, who was Mormon, which he was super devout Mormon, but Mormon, for a lot of evangelicals, Mormons are not okay. Like they fall outside of the bounds of orthodoxy. And then Donald Trump, who I don't care what anybody says, dude is not a Christian in any meaningful way. He doesn't understand Christian theology. I mean, partisanship aside, there's no facts that back that idea. So it's interesting that the party of religiously devout people, their last 3 nominees have not been particularly, George W. Bush was the ideal white evangelical candidate, right? Because he spoke the language, he was born again, he did all those things. And the party then nominated 3 people who are not in that mold since then, but white evangelicals still voted for all those guys at the exact same level, which tells you something, that white evangelicals care a lot about partisanship and less about religion than we think. I mean, what happens if Donald Trump's born again, like a true blue, died in the will, born again? Does he get 82%? 80? I mean, where do you can't go much farther up from 78 or 80% vote share. So I don't think the religiosity of the candidate matters as much as we think it does. I think it's just pure blind partisanship.
So about 80% of evangelicals, and you're expecting it's going to remain the same. Okay, Let's go to mainline Protestants. Where do mainline Protestants shake out?
So there's this interesting thing that people assume that mainline Protestants are liberals. Like that's what I always hear, like the liberal mainline, like those 2 words like go together, like peanut butter and jelly.
The Episcopal Church, United Methodist Church, again, just for people that are not.
Yes, like Mayor Pete, for instance, was an Episcopalian, right? With like liberal Episcopalians and all these kind of things. People don't know this, but they're not that liberal. Mainline churches, the majority of mainline Protestants. So if you track the average partisanship of mainline Protestants from 1972 to today, they never go left of independent. They're always to the right of center. Always to the right of center. You cannot describe them as liberals. They are what I would call country club Republicans, though, which is in modern parlance might be liberal, which means that they don't like taxes. They don't like government regulation. They like small government. But they also don't care if you want to smoke a little bit of weed on the weekends, or maybe if gay people want to get married. Like that's not any of their concern, right? They're more economic conservatives and social moderates than they are sort of evangelical style conservative on both dimensions. So that makes them look liberal in some ways, but they're actually not that liberal. And this is super important, most of those traditions, Episcopalians, ELCA, United Methodist Church, have all become more Republican over the last decade.
Hold on a second, Dr. Burge, because that is a pretty surprising data point that you just brought up. And so for those who maybe are not familiar listening or watching, I mean, when you talk about the ELCA, which is
Evangelical
Lutheran Church, as well as the Episcopal Church in America, you're talking about mainline denominations that have become more affirming and intentionally have opened their arms more like to, say, LGBT community, as well as to other policies that maybe would traditionally be seen on the more left side of the spectrum. But you're saying that and that maybe has increased in the last 10 years, but in spite of that, you're saying actually they've become more Republican. Explain that a little bit. That's very interesting.
So those denominations are incredibly white first. I mean, they're 90% plus white, most of them. And they're getting older, like we just talked about. And those 2 pieces by themselves are sort of a recipe for becoming more, we know people become more Republican as they age. I mean, especially among white people. So when your average congregant is a college-educated white person who is 60 years old, that spells Republican in almost every possible way. So you got to think, so the ELCA is a fascinating group. They actually declared themselves a sanctuary denomination a couple of months ago. A denomination, not a church, a sanctuary denomination, which means they will shelter people here who are in this country illegally. The average ELCA is more Republican today than they were 5 or 10 years ago. You got to understand there's a huge disconnect between what happens at the top, at the organizational level, the denominational level, and what happens at the bottom in the pews. these organizations are seen as very liberal, and a lot of them are. A lot of people in the higher ups in these churches are liberal. But when you get down to the congregational level, most people there you would not want to describe as liberal, and most are probably moderate or center right when it comes to politics. So there's no counterbalance to the Southern Baptist Convention. There's no liberal large denomination in America that's white. And even the black church is not that large compared to Southern Baptist Convention. So there really is no liberal Protestant large group in America today.
So, Dr. Burge, I don't want to drop this because this is a story that has been picked up a lot in the last year. There have been major discussions about marriage, equality, the LGBT community, so on and so forth within the United Methodist Church, among others. So, as far as you're saying, becoming more Republican, it would seem that there were probably maybe two ways that could happen, that more Republicans are joining the church, or that people who are not Republicans are leaving the church. I mean, which of those two, or is it a combination, or maybe some other phenomenon that you could describe?
I think we can't say there's more people joining because we know the numbers have collapsed.
They are getting smaller, these denominations.
Yeah.
As well.
So there's not joining is not happening, at least not in large numbers that would move the larger shifts in America. So that's not it. I think what it is, it's a natural aging process that's going on, and people just become more conservative as they get older, and they become more Republican as they get older. And I think a lot of the things that made these mainline churches unique, they don't preach that kind of stuff from the pulpit anymore, right? So things like LGBT, things like racial issues, those just don't show up in a lot of rural Episcopal churches. That's just not on the minds of a lot of people. Now, obviously, there's going to be an urban versus rural divide here too, though, right? Like an ELCA church in like Minneapolis is going to be a lot more liberal than an ELCA church in some rural county in northern Minnesota. So we got to keep that in mind. But on balance, these mainline churches are becoming more Republican as well. So when I say this, so this God gap, I think, is so super important, right? That people who are religious in America, think about this, half of white liberals in America today are nuns. Half of white liberals today in America.
Really?
Yes.
So let me, that prompts me to immediately ask this question.
Yeah.
If somebody would consider themselves a progressive Christian, or somebody that would call themselves on the left, a Democrat, what have you, affiliation, where do they go? Where are they? What is the natural home for those people, or is there a home for those people?
There's not. I mean, the long and the short of it is there's just not a home for them. There's this idea called the spiral of silence. It's like this theory in the communication literature, which basically says that people are really good at wanting to blend in. Like that's our natural instinct as human beings, not to stand out. It goes back to like evolutionary psychology. Because you stood out, you got eaten by the lions, right? So you want to be part of the pack. So if you are in a church that you like the theology, you like the people, but you are a liberal and the rest of the church is conservative, you figure that out really quickly. And so what you do is you just shut up when it comes to politics. But the problem with that is people imply as silence as consent or as agreement. And so what everyone begins to think is, well, everyone thinks just like us. Everyone believes just like us. In reality, there are these people who are like cringing at the sermon sometimes and cringing at what's happening with the congregational, the discussions that happen with the congregation sometimes, but they like the community so much and they like the theology, maybe the church so much, that they just shut up and grin and bear it because they have no other options. Because there's I bet you there's hundreds of counties in America today, you cannot find a Protestant church that is LGBT affirming, this large. They just don't exist in most parts of rural America because it's just become American religion has become American conservative religion. And we sort of lost a moderate strain of American Christianity, which objectively, not my own perspective, objectively is a bad thing if you're a Christian, because it means you cannot be a Christian and be a Democrat, or it's hard to be a Christian and be a Democrat. And if you look at the data, the nuns, the people who left the church, 30% of liberals now have left the church. Only 12% of conservatives have left the church. Okay.
Well, that was going to be my next question. So there is a correlation between people who identify as liberals and Christians and then becoming nuns. There's a correlation there.
So there's a question that asks, like, how do you describe your ideology from very conservative, moderate, liberal, or very liberal? And if you look at the rate of disaffiliation going from conservative, it goes like 12%, 15%, 18%, 22%, 30%, going from left to right. So the more liberal you are, the more likely you are to disaffiliate now. And the steepness of those lines for liberals has gone up over time. So basically what's happened was conservatives stick around and liberals have left American Christianity.
Wow. So, okay, then let's talk about, like Catholics. Where do Catholics shake out?
Yeah. So it's the white, non-white divide, like we talked about. So white Catholics, 60% of white Catholics voted for Trump in 2016. And
60%. So Catholics, I mean, it's,
Mhm.
Catholics, obviously there's a large concentration of Catholics in, say, the Northeast and then
Yes.
on the West Coast and in states that are traditionally considered more blue states. I mean, does that factor, or you're saying it's really not so much of a,
So I think New England, we don't want to mistake New England Catholics for Catholics in the rest of the country, okay?
okay.
Because New England Catholicism is a very unique thing. It's very cultural, like we talked about. People were raised Irish Catholic, or even from places in Europe came there. Italian Catholics, for instance. In the rest of America, Catholics are kind of divorced from that kind of stuff, for good or for bad. But Catholics are white, and the average Catholic is getting older every year, right? And all those things are sort of adding up to this idea. So 60% voted for Trump in 2016. Then they asked the question, who would you vote for in 2020? Or who do you plan to vote for in 2020? Trump or the Democrat? Because this is before, Biden was the nominee. Exact same number said they would vote for Trump in 2020, 60%.
Wow.
So again, like, these baselines are these baselines. They're not going anywhere. The idea of a swing voter just does not show up in the data. I'll give you a good example. So I had a reporter ask me, she was going to write a story about evangelicals who were never Trump, who became Trump, like from 2016 to now. She
Hmm.
said, do you have any data about this? I said, oh, yeah. Let me go look. I have panel data about this, which is, like I told you, they asked the same people the same questions over a period of time. There were 4,500 evangelicals in the panel. 22 of them changed who they were going to vote for in 2020 versus 2016. Out
Wow.
of 4,500 people, 22 of them said they were going to change their vote.
Half of a
Half a
percent.
percent. Yeah, half of
Wow.
1%. So that's not a thing. Vote changing is not a thing in American politics. You are what you are. You vote your partisanship. I know that doesn't make like compelling TV or podcast, but the reality is partisanship swamps everything in America today, including religion in a lot of ways.
So I was going to ask you then. I want to ask about communities of color in Christianity and then in other faiths and how that shakes out. But let me ask you this: you prompt this. I mean, is partisanship ultimately a more important sociological phenomenon in America now than religious affiliation?
100% yes. 100% yes. And there's actually been some work that's starting to come out now on things like this. The question is, so there's this problem we have in research methodology called endogeneity, which is the idea of what causes what in a variable relationship. So with religion and politics, does religion impact your politics, or does politics impact your religion? Like, what comes first, chicken or the egg? That's like one of the problems that plague social science, because some of these things happen at the same time, right? So for a long time, the belief was that religion is your primary identity, and then everything is sort of filtered through this lens of religion. You think about, what does my church teach about abortion or gay marriage or taxes, or whatever it is. Now, there's been a good amount of research that's come out just recently. A book called From Politics to Pews by Michelle Margolis. My buddy Paul Jube and a couple guys wrote an article for AJPS. They find that people change their church based on their politics more than the other thing that happens, which is they change.
Really?
Yes. The data is becoming pretty overwhelming now. They did panel data. Where do you go to church? Have you left church? That kind of thing. I actually published a piece with Paul in Christianity Today. We found that people who voted for Hillary Clinton, evangelicals who voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016, were 50% more likely to become a nun after the election than evangelicals who voted for Donald Trump. So people are realizing that evangelicalism is not a place for Democrats and not a place for liberals. So they're leaving their church based on their political partisanship. It never happens the other way.
Dr. Burge, you mentioned already the exit of, let's say, white liberals from Christian churches to nuns. That's a more common phenomenon. You mentioned it again here. Is
Yep.
the opposite of that true? Do people who identify as Republicans, are they more likely to become, let's say, evangelicals or something to that extent? I mean, or are they already maybe evangelicals? I mean, what is the affiliation there?
So that's a harder one to figure out, okay? Because what you're going to have to look for is things like changes in church attendance over time. Because, I mean, listen, the nuns are liberals and Democrats. For instance, 77% of atheists identify as Democrats. Okay, so that's like becoming an atheist is almost synonymous to becoming a Democrat. In the same way, by the way, that being white evangelical is being synonymous with a Republican. It's really hard to figure out empirically if it's the identity thing, or is just the if you go to church more, for instance, like do you go to church more because you're a Republican? The church teaches more Republican ideas. We don't know that for sure because that's really hard to figure out methodologically. You'd have to spend tons of money to figure out something like that. So we don't know if it makes you more religiously devout. But what we do know is if you're a Republican, it's a lot easier to be a Christian than if you're a Democrat. Right. So those kind of things are sort of melded together as one identity.
So anybody that's watching with many, many millions of dollars to pour into a research study at Eastern Illinois University, Dr.
Yes.
Burge, it sounds like, is looking for big dollars.
Please.
But so, I mean, this is very interesting to me that I mean, it is. You just think naturally that religion would be the driver. In what other areas of life, let's say, or socioeconomics, or affiliation in society and organizations, et cetera? I mean, some of this is obvious, but empirically, where does the political affiliation versus the religious affiliation, where does that determine how people place themselves in America today?
So there's this really puzzling thing that we always think about when it comes to American religion and politics is why are evangelicals economically conservative? Like, that's actually a really hard question. People think it's like, oh, it's so simple. No, it's not, because Christianity doesn't really, I mean, does teach some capitalistic things, but I mean, there's a strong evangelical tradition in America for more socialistic, more government intervention, these kind of things. What we think is it's sort of economics for most Christians sort of goes along with the other stuff, right? So like we talked about what your lens is. So your partisan lens is, you look at everything through a partisan perspective. And so you think, okay, I'm a Republican because of abortion or gay marriage or family issues or whatever. That's what I really vote on. But you know what? I can convince myself that tax cuts are a good thing, or cutting unemployment benefits are a good thing, or smaller government's a good thing. It's sort of a come along thing that sort of because we don't like this thing called cognitive dissonance, which is the idea that like we can't hold two ideas in our head at one time. It's hard to be a socialist Republican, right? It's hard to, be in favor of things like Obamacare if you're Republican, because the Republican Party has this very sort of coherent idea about things. So that's always puzzled me, right? Why, evangelicals are not more moderate when it comes to issues of economics, because, in 1905, the best-selling Christian book in America for 3 years straight was called Christianity and the Social Crisis, written by Walter Rauschenbusch. It was basically an indictment of it was actually an argument for the social gospel. And then Glenn Beck, 100 years later, says, if your church teaches the social gospel, you got to get out of there, because that's not the real gospel, which goes to show you how malleable we are on issues of economics, because the church does not teach, and this is an important point. Let me make this point. Christian pastors don't talk about politics from the pulpit hardly at all, okay? The people that do make TV. The people that don't never get talked about because they're kind of boring and they're not controversial. But I've had many pastors tell me, I don't talk about politics in the pulpit. They say, but here's the problem. Even if I did, I get them for 30 minutes once a week. Fox News gets them for 8 hours a day, 7 days a week. And no matter what I say or how convincing I am, I can't beat back Facebook and podcasts and Twitter and everything else they get. So I just throw up my hands and say, I'm going to talk about Jesus and the gospel and theology and not talk about politics at all. So what happens is, in that vacuum, something else has to fill that in. And I think that's the media, that's social media, that's all these other things.
So, Dr. Burge, what comes to mind, you mentioned that economics kind of comes along for the ride with maybe some of these other issues. The first thing I thought of was the issue of free trade in recent years. Yeah. And I'm citing here a Politico poll from 2016. This was during the election, September 24th, 2016. The lead of the story: in a stunning reversal, a large majority of Republicans are repudiating their party's traditional support for free trade and falling sharply in line with nominee Donald Trump's insistence that trade costs Americans more job than it creates. In that story, a little further down, this particular poll said that 47% of Republicans said trade deals have hurt their communities over the last 10 years, compared to only 24% of Democratic voters. Only 18% of Republicans surveyed said that trade deals helped, while 33% of Democrats believe free trade helps. Now, I don't have the data to show all of that over time, as you do, Dr. Burge, but that would certainly be an issue where it seems like the direction of the party or the individual who is leading the party, in this case President Trump, is really determining the specificity of a policy that most Americans maybe haven't thought of. Or am I reading that correctly?
No.
Or
Yeah. Okay. So there's this term in political science. Carmines and Stinson came up with it. It's called easy issues versus hard issues. So like easy issues like abortion, gay marriage, where it's like you don't have to think, you just know. Free trade is like the classic hard issue, because like how do you ask a polling question about free? Does anyone really understand free trade? Like I'm a political scientist. I don't even understand free trade. Like all the implications of free trade policy. Like no one really does, because it's like it goes all the way from cultural to agriculture to currency to arbitrage. Like there's all these things that go into free trade, right? That when you ask someone a question like that, what are they going to defer to? Their partisanship. And what does the standard bearer of their party believe? And if their standard bearer is Donald Trump and railed against NAFTA and Chinese trade deals for years and years and years, what are you going to say? I believe what that guy believes, right? Because if no one, if you don't have an easy issue that you can just figure out real quick, you have to defer to, it's called a heuristic. It's a shortcut. You just look at someone who's smart and go, I like what they like. Or what do you think about this? And if Trump says I'm against free trade, then you go, I am too. Which is funny, like you just talked about, because Republicans for years and years and years have been the party of free trade, open trade, lower tariffs, and all these things. So that's a good example, I think, of where partisanship trumps everything else, especially in an information vacuum on issues like free trade.
Dr. Burge, good word, heuristic, one of the favorite words of one of my political science professors at Texas A&M. So, and then that is a nonpartisan phenomenon, correct? I mean, Democrats and Republicans both are going to follow the leader on these sorts of things. On these, what you say, hard issues.
Yep.
So what about communities of color, people who are African American, people who are Latino, people who are other maybe immigrant communities? I mean, where do they shake out in this, not only among Christianity, but also in the other religions and within the nuns? I mean, there's, I've seen certain data to suggest that, certain, for example, African American churches, maybe have a different set of political beliefs. This was brought up while Joe Biden was winning in South Carolina, that they maybe are more socially conservative. But it's hard to know, again, without having the data in front of us. Dr. Burge, what do you know?
Yeah, so we actually break Black Protestants out into their own category. So there's three types of Protestants. There's evangelical, there's mainline, which you talked about both. And there's Black Protestant, which is the third category. And people are like, you're racist. Why do you do that? It's because the Black church in America is a totally different institution than the white church in America. And that goes back all the way to slavery in the Jim Crow days. If you were Black in America in the South, even in the 1950s and 60s, you were not allowed in polite society, in general, in company, right? With the people who had the power of the day. So, you know what? If you wanted to if you wanted to go hang out with people, the church was the place that you went. So the church became the social hub, the economic hub, and it became the political hub of America. So like we see like candidates go and campaign at churches on Sunday morning. And white people are like, oh my goodness, clutching their pearls and stuff. It's because if you were a Black candidate in the South, you couldn't get in a white church to campaign, but the Black church would embrace you because, there was no other place for you to go. So it became a culturally accepted thing for Black candidates or even white candidates to go to Black churches and campaign there. So Black Protestants are super interesting because you are right. Socially, they're very conservative. They're slightly more moderate on abortion than white evangelicals are, but not by much. And on things like issues like gay marriage, they're in lockstep with white evangelicals. However, and this is the thing, Black people in America are Democrats. Like that's not over exaggeration. Like 90%, 88% of Black Protestants identify as Democrats. Okay, that's just who they are. That's their partisanship. Now, what electorally, that's very disadvantageous for Democrats, though, because they're all concentrated in urban areas by and large. So they can't really help in a lot of swing states. So interestingly enough, Black Protestants are just as literalist as white evangelicals are. So they have a very similar view of the Bible as well. They're actually very devout in how often they go to church, but their political structure is totally different, right? They typically tend to vote for Democrats. But, and I will say this is something super interesting. Amongst the youngest Black Protestants who go to church once a week or more, they actually were less likely to vote for Hillary Clinton than older Black Protestants who go to church once a week or more. So
Really?
yeah,
So younger
yes, devout
black
Black Protestants.
Protestants
Yes,
are more are I mean
less Democrat.
less democratic, but I mean is that why is that? I mean that's a very interesting
I
breakout.
don't know if I have a coherent theory as to why yet, but I do think that with Christianity in America being seen more and more tied with the Republican Party, and Democrats being tied with the party of the nuns, I think a lot of devout young Black Protestants think, well, wait, I'm a Christian, like, and I don't want to do what my parents told me to do, which is vote for the Democrats and my uncles and aunts and all these kind of things. I think there might be some pullback there. I think there might be some. Now it's early, right? So I've only seen it in 2016. I'll look at 2020 and I'll tell you then. But I think there's something there that young Black Protestants, devout Black Protestants, might actually be not as solidly blue as they have been for decades now. Something to watch.
So, in Fox News poll, April 4th through 7th of this year, found that I guess 19% of African American voters approved of President Trump, and I think that in a similar vein, apparently 8% in 2016 supported the president. How do
Mm-hmm.
those numbers look compared to the past? Do you think that African American Christians are going to support Trump in larger numbers, or is it going to be about the same as always?
No, I think any outreach to Black Protestants among the Trump campaign is a waste of time. I mean, it just really is. That group. I mean, maybe they could run a candidate who would have some more appeal to the Black community. I don't know who that would be specifically, but I mean, no, and there's also some discussion about, and I've actually had people ask me this question: should the Biden campaign reach out to white evangelicals? The answer is absolutely not. That's also a waste of time. I mean, his approval rating amongst white evangelicals is incredibly low. I think 80% of white evangelicals disapprove of him. So like,
Wow.
there's no room, like we talked about. I know this gets like repetitive. I don't want to be repetitive.
No, but
It swamps everything.
partisanship is the driving force. So
It
I
is.
suppose then the natural follow up here, Dr. Burge, who are the swing voters? Who are the independents? What is their affiliation? I mean, who
Yeah.
are those folks?
So I think the nothing in particular are actually the swing voters in America. The people.
Really?
Yeah, I really do.
Okay, so the nuns are who you'd pin as kind of
Yep.
these independents, or the
Mm-hmm.
maybe the centrists in the both parties that would swing
Yep.
and so forth.
I think they're swing voters for a couple of reasons. First off, they don't have a strong attachment to either party because they don't have a religious tradition that sort of like ties them to either party. But here's the problem with them: they don't turn out to vote because they're low education, low income voters, right? They're the people we can't get to polls because they don't go to polls because they're disconnected from society. Here's what I think, and this is what people don't understand: the 2016 election was decided by about 70,000 votes in a couple swing states, amongst places like Wisconsin and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan, places like that. And guess what? The voters that I think are the swing voters in America today are white men who are factory workers, blue collar, 2 years of college or less, and don't go to church at all in rural parts of places like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan. Those are the kind, and they're not talking about religion at all right now, but those are the kind of voters that do change their minds over time because they're not as strongly tied to one party or another, for instance, like evangelicals are, or Black Protestants, or atheists.
So, Dr. Burge, okay, so I think you've painted a very vivid picture then. I think all of us can imagine a factory worker in Pennsylvania. There are fewer of them than there used to be,
Yes.
and in these other states, obviously.
Yep.
But as manufacturing has declined in America over a long period of time. But for those individuals, if they go to the voting booth,
Mm-hmm.
and as you say, a smaller number that 70,000 kind of made this determination in 2016, and they pull the lever one way or the other. They are making a determination based on a signal, based on data, based on what? Where is that determination coming from?
There's been 100,000 books written about voting behavior in American politics, right? I mean, it can be
But
anything.
you have the special answer, don't you? I mean,
No, I know.
they're going to spend $2 billion on these campaigns, but Dr. Burge, they should be talking to you. It sounds like so. But
no,
but if you were, well, let me put it this way: if you were Joe Biden and Donald Trump's campaign managers, either of them, how do you win that small sliver of people, assuming everything else was equal as in 2016, and you had the same number of swing voters?
Yep.
What is the signal? Is it something, are they watching, cable news? Are they
Yep.
reading the newspaper? Or is it, I mean, you're saying they're more apathetic and they're maybe a little bit less likely to consume such media. Where are they getting those intentions from?
I think a lot of them are on Facebook. I think that's what the Trump campaign flooded Facebook in 2016, and the Hillary Clinton campaign didn't take it as seriously as they should. I think they underappreciate how much penetration Facebook has had in the middle part of the country. Even like guys who are not tech savvy have Facebook on their phones. Like it is the pervasive social media application, not Twitter, not Instagram, not Snapchat, not any of those things. Facebook is where it's at. That's where the ads get to people. That's where the fake news gets generated and perpetuated is on Facebook. Here's what I would do if I was the Biden campaign. I would flood Facebook with ads that just take aim at Donald Trump's incompetence or perceived incompetence in handling COVID-19. And I would say, make an economic argument. Look at where jobs are today versus when he took office, right? How are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? If you are, go vote for the guy again. But what the Biden campaign has to be careful with, and this is what the Democratic Party, see, if just from a purely, like, take all parts aside, right? If I was saying which candidate has an easier election time, it's the Republican candidate 100 times out of 100, because the Republican Party is basically all white people. 90% of Republicans today are white people. You know what Democrats are? Everybody else, all different races, the nuns, but also some Black Protestants, right? They're urban, they're rural. That is such a hard coalition to hold together. The Republican Party has a very simple argument, right? We will do these things. Economy's gone up. Biden has to be super careful. These white guys, and I know these, I live in rural America right now. I live in places like this. I can tell you they need to stop talking about things like LGBT, about transgendered bathrooms, about the Green New Deal. That doesn't motivate 50-year-old Bob at the factory to vote for you. You know what motivates Bob? I'm going to make sure that you get a pay raise, or I'm going to make sure that your insurance premiums go down. I'm going to make sure if you get laid off from your job, you have unemployment insurance that lasts for 6 months. I'm going to do all these things to make your life a little bit easier economically, right? That's the argument you have to make. Now, don't let AOC paint you with socialism and all that garbage, because they're going to try to do that. Listen, you say it's not about that. You got to make it. You got, as bad as it sounds, you got to take a little page from Bernie's handbook. The playbook about the 1% of the 1%. They took all this money and all that kind of stuff. You know what? Bob in rural Michigan, that plays with Bob in rural Michigan. I know it does, because I know people just like Bob in rural Michigan. That's what I would do. I would make this argument completely economic, and I would just run ads nonstop on Facebook, especially guys like Bob in rural Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania. That's where the election. And I will say this. I think Biden is better positioned to win those states than any other Democrat that was in the field. I really do. I think
Interesting.
I think he has the best chance of that, besides the fact he's 78, and besides the fact he's got all these, the other problems. He has a ton of problems. He's not an ideal candidate by any stretch. But a guy like Bernie's not going to win Pennsylvania. A guy like Bernie's not going to win Wisconsin. But Biden has some cachet with those people. I think they see him as blue collar Joe. And he's Catholic. I think he stirs up that base too. He's Catholic, and people identify with his faith. He talks very authentically about his faith. I think he can, if he doesn't stumble over his words, which he does sometimes. I think he does. He could peel some voters back.
So what you're saying, Dr. Burge, it sounds like, is that, it really is about it's about the personal impact of these policies. Or, I think it was the famous Louisiana governor, the Kingfish, Huey Long, who used to go campaign with the slogan, "A chicken in every pot." And you're saying it really is a personal thing. So, and then if you were Trump's campaign manager, how do you retain or keep those individuals on your side at this point?
You keep hammering the Democrats as liberals, as out of touch, about caring about things that you don't care about. Things like, do you really care about the Green New Deal? You really don't care about the Green New Deal. Do you care about transgender rights? You don't even know anybody who's got transgender rights. You try to paint the Democratic Party as looking like extreme. You trot out Bernie quotes, trot out AOC quotes. You try to make Biden look incompetent. You talk about abortion. Biden used to be somewhat of a moderate on abortion, like the Hyde Amendment, things like that. You go, now he wants to give everyone abortions for free. You make him look as extreme as you possibly can, because in some ways the Democratic Party shoots itself in its own foot by being as extreme as it possibly can. And you paint them to be out of touch. They're not the party of Bob, middle-class Bob, 50-year-old Bob in rural Wisconsin. They're the party of urban nuns, young hipsters. And that's not you, Bob. You're the party of America, and they don't like America. That's what I would do. I would make it about those
Interesting.
kind of things. Yeah.
Interesting analysis, Dr. Burge. So what? How much of this is turnout? I mean, what do you have to say about turnout as a political scientist?
Yeah, so turnout is a weird thing because it's hard to know what people like. If we get more vote, people will come out to vote. We're going to win because more people come out to vote. We will win, right? But here's the looming problem that we have. COVID-19 makes it super hard to vote in person, and we're dealing with this mail-in vote idea, right? That is looming over this whole election. I do think turnout matters, but I don't think Biden gets anyone too excited. Not the way that Barack Obama got people excited. I don't think that Trump gets people excited. The re-election election is never as high turnout as the open seat election was. Like, for instance, like the 96 election was such a snoozer, like Bob Dole and Bill Clinton for re-election. I think this sort of has the makings of that in some kind of way. I do think there's some more anti-Trump backlash now. There was anti-Clinton backlash in 1996, but we're not going to see the turnout levels we saw in 2008 when Barack Obama won
Right.
against Mitt Romney, or I'm sorry, against John McCain. It's going to be a lower turnout election, which I think does not help the Biden campaign very much. But let's be honest, Biden does not get anyone that excited.
So what is the impact of mail-in voting? Because that would
Yeah.
seem to want to juice the turnout a little bit. And who would that
Yes.
impact? Who would that affect?
So this is what we know as political scientists. There was a study that came out yesterday. I read some of my friends who are political scientists did the study in Colorado where they implemented mail-in voting this time. And what they found was it increased voter turnout for every economic group, every racial group, every education group by 10%. Overall turnout went up by 10%. And there's tons of other evidence that says that it does not bias the election towards one party or the other party. It actually, it's sort of a break-even thing. And from a political science perspective, if you told me that we could implement a reform where 10% more people would vote and it doesn't give a systematic, benefit to one party or another, I'd say sign me up right now. That's exactly what we want from a political science perspective, or institutional perspective. So I think that what the mail-in voting thing is a talking point for Republicans that makes no sense from an empirical perspective. It's good. It's good for democracy. It's good for our country. It's good for America. We should implement it today.
So, Dr. Burge, I think we're going to kind of start winding down. I have several questions I want to ask you. You've been very generous with your time.
Sure.
I want to ask you as a pastor, because you are an American Baptist pastor.
Yep.
We talk about maybe the decline in religiosity in America and some of these other topics. And you mentioned catechism, the lack of catechism in certain churches. As a pastor, and also dealing with this, the question of partisan affiliation, how do you navigate this? What are you saying to your congregation about all of this? How do you guide them through this complicated socio-political landscape?
Yeah. I try to tell them that having a Christian worldview is the most important thing they can have. And whether that causes them to vote for a Democrat or a Republican is none of my concern. So there's this theological concept that I really love called Imago Dei, which has been, it goes back hundreds of years in the Christian tradition. And basically it argues that every human being, no matter race, color, creed, is born in the image and likeness of God. And what that means is they have dignity and worth as a human being, whether that means they're an unborn child or whether they're an illegal immigrant, that they are cared for by God and that they're created in God's image, just like I was created in God's image, which means I should shape my policy and my views of the world based around the idea that no one is worth less or more than I am, which means that we should do things that maybe Democrats don't like. We also do things that Republicans don't like too, right? We should stand up for people. And if we can teach people to have a Christian worldview, I think things like a consistent ethic of life are not talked about enough in the church. The idea that maybe the death, being pro-life, but then pro-death penalty is sort of theologically troublesome in a lot of ways. Like, I think those are the kind of discussions we need to have with Christians and try to say, listen, if you believe in the Bible and you are a Christian, a professing Christian, you have to see the world the way Jesus saw the world and the way that Jesus sees each one of us, which is that we are all precious in his sight, no matter what color, creed, race, origin, or whatever it is, right? I think when we start talking in those ways, it's great because it makes the Democrats in my congregation mad and it makes the Republicans in my congregation mad, which is exactly what I want. I want to upset your worldview. I want to say things that make you go, wow, maybe the media I'm consuming is not all right on this thing. And I think this is super important. I think that pastors have created a vacuum and where they've made it okay for their congregations to do things like share fake stories on Facebook, or gossip about things that are untrue. I think that is one of the worst things that Christians can do, because what it says to people who are non-Christians, it says is those Christians are not even diligent enough to parse what they see on Facebook and think through it critically before hitting the share button.
Well, Dr. Burge, I have to ask you, you bring that up and it sounds as though, I may be incorrect in asking this, but it sounds as though you're thinking of specific examples with this. So what is a couple examples maybe of this phenomenon of people sharing things that you would say inappropriate and maybe a pastor's failure to act in that?
Yeah, so I actually saw one of my friends I went to high school with is a pastor of a church down in Florida. And he posted about an experience he had going to the post office where he couldn't get good service because they didn't speak English. And his hashtag was "not my country." And I didn't call him out publicly, but I wanted to call him out publicly. And thank goodness I checked his page a day later and he deleted it. But I wanted to say, you believe that everyone in this planet is born in the image and likeness of God, just like I do. And I know you had a bad experience as a pastor, but to put that out there, it gives your congregation permission to discriminate against people based on the language that they speak or the color of their skin. And that is not okay. That should not come out of a pastor's mouth. And we should rebuke that. I really think that Christians have been timid. When we hear a fellow Christian telling a racist joke or using a racial epithet, we have to stop that. That has to end. Because if we believe what the Bible teaches, which is everyone's born in the image and likeness of God, we can't use words like that because that demeans people. Some of the people who share the fakest stuff on my Facebook page are the most devout Christians. Things like there are Muslims going to institute Sharia law in this country that's based on absolutely nothing. I'm amazed at the number of stories. And I go down these rabbit holes sometimes where I'll see someone share a story and I'll go try to find like the source of that story. And there's no source. Like it's literally, there's a story. Oh, for instance, just a quick story. There's a story came out 10 days ago about a clinic in Chicago that was doing serology antibodies testing for COVID-19. And it said the phlebotomist said that 30% of the patients they tested had the antibodies. The phlebotomist who was drawing the blood was speaking to the media about blood tests. And then I looked up the woman. The only place she showed up was on LinkedIn. And you know what? Every story, it went on Rush. It was on the Daily Caller. It was on Breitbart. All three stories picked up that first story that was not vetted at all. Not at all. And that's what drives me nuts because I spent 30 minutes investigating a story that someone just read the headline and hit share and then thought that, this whole thing is 30% of people will have antibodies. That is dangerous from a public health perspective. So that's the thing I'm talking about. It's so hard to fight fake news and it's so easy to make stuff up because the website that created that story probably got 1 million clicks and got a bunch of ad revenue for making things up. There's no incentive to being truthful anymore. There's only incentive to be sensationalistic and having no journalistic integrity. And that really bothers me. So
well, Dr. Burge, you mentioned earlier that you're a quant. You're really in love with the data.
Yeah.
So one would imagine that a lack of sources bothers you. How much do you see that, let's say, the broad brush or the shallowness? How much has that infected the churches themselves that you see, or maybe the people that you pastor over, or churches in your area? I mean, do you feel like I think what you're referring to is you're saying, okay, sourceless news, or some people would say fake news. Is there fake news in religion? Is there fake news in theology? Is there, things that people are coming to believe maybe that don't have a source or what have you? Or how would you describe that? Or is that even a thing? I mean,
I don't think it's as widespread, but I think evangelicals love to, I don't know, overemphasize stories that talk about their persecution. For instance, there was a graduation ceremony about 30 miles away where a kid wanted to say a prayer before the graduation, as part of the program, and the superintendent said he couldn't do that. And that became like a national news story, right? Like evangelicals are really bad about looking for instances where, something bad happens to them. And in reality, what it is most of the time? One idiot doing something idiotic without thinking. It's not a systematic thing where evangelicals are being discriminated against on a large scale. I think that's where the fake news comes with evangelicals is they find the one story of someone doing something stupid to someone, not thinking for, a religious reason. And they want to blow that up and say that's emblematic of what's going on. Christianity in America is under attack. I just think that's such a poisonous way, because you know what it does? It creates us versus them, right? They're fighting against us. And I don't believe that way. I don't think the Bible teaches us that way. Like I talked about, I believe that everyone's born in the image and likeness of God. They're not my enemy. They're not trying to stop me. They just have a different view of the world than I do. And I think, unfortunately, social media can perpetuate these longstanding myths that exist in certain cultures, and then they get fed on, they get shared, and they don't get really thought about the way they should. And it just creates this downward spiral. Like, look how bad we have it in America as white evangelicals. That is such a garbage narrative. I mean, white evangelicals have it really, really good in America, and they're not persecuted on a grand scale. They actually have a lot of privileges that other religious groups would love to have that they don't have. So that's where I see it.
So earlier on this program, a few weeks ago, I interviewed blogger Rod Dreher, who wrote a book, a national best-selling book, The Benedict Option, which talks about Christians creating intentional communities, kind of a little bit maybe set apart from the mainstream fabric of society, and trying to preserve small o Orthodox Christianity. And Rod blogs quite a bit about what you say, the persecution of Christians. Is there any reality to the persecution of Christians, maybe as blogged about by somebody like Rod Dreher or others, many others? Or do you feel like generally that is not an issue that is as serious, or maybe just not existent at all?
I just think it's overblown. I mean, it does happen. Like, I'm not gonna dispute the fact that, that there are instances where evangelicals are persecuted, but I could name I'll give you a great example. Someone in my family is a school teacher in a small school in a rural part of America. I went to their Christmas program a couple of years ago. They were reading scripture during the Christmas program at a public school. That's clearly a violation of I'm not a constitutional scholar. That's clearly a violation of the Constitution, right? So for every instance where, we get a media account of evangelicals being persecuted, the times when evangelicals get away with stuff they shouldn't get away with is 100-fold, but no one reports about those stories, right? So that's the thing. I always think about the unheard voice or the untold story. How many of those are there out there that counterbalance the one story that gets told? And I will tell you, 100 times a day across America, Christians get away with stuff that Muslims or Buddhists or Hindus could never get away with, because they're the dominant culture and no one wants to stand up against Christianity. So I have a hard time with that.
So with Dreher's book, with the Benedict Option, that's become a very popular book in a variety of, I think, faith circles, people that talk and write about religion and specifically Christianity, but other faiths as well. Do you believe that there is any need or legitimacy to the idea of people creating intentional communities centered around faith, or is that, in your view, not needed in America?
I think it's an interesting idea, but I think it's sort of impractical in any sort of real way, right? I think communal living sounds so good, but man, it's so hard to do in a really meaningful long-term way. There's a lot of sociological research about people who start like communes and start planning communities and things like that, and inevitably they sort of fall apart at some point, because things like power structures and sharing and all those things sort of break down. I do think the interesting thing about this idea of the Benedict option is Christians sort of retreating from society, political society especially. I think that's a really interesting way to think about it, because American Christianity for a long time, especially from about the 1920s to the 1960s or 70s, American evangelicals, there's a line about them in, I think, in Time magazine, evangelicals are so heavenly minded they're of no earthly good. I think about that a lot, because they just retreated from American society because they saw that politics is a dirty business, and it's a sinful bit. It's an evil business. And in a lot of ways it is, because it's about power. That we should remove ourselves from that and let the world figure that part out. We can do what we're going to do over here by ourselves. I find that option incredibly attractive, but also incredibly worrisome all at the same time. Attractive because, listen, neither party speaks well for Christian theology right now. Christian identity right now. I think both parties have good things that they speak to, but also there's things that I vehemently disagree with on both sides. But on the other hand, I'm a political scientist, so I want people to get out there. I want the people to get involved and because we know what happens when people don't vote. They feel like the government doesn't work for them, and that's what causes like unrest and civil disobedience and all these things, when they feel like the government doesn't reflect their needs. So if you don't vote, then you really have no say in what happens, and therefore it gives you a sense of resentment, which is not what you want to have in a democracy, especially the democracy we have right now. I think is sort of in a precarious position. So I don't know what the answer is for Christians. I think the answer for Christians is to run better candidates. I think, to find a different way in politics where you are to the right of Democrats and to the left of Republicans.
Well,
Right?
you talk so now I'm going to address you, Dr. Burge, but also Pastor here.
Sure.
Earlier, you talked about how institutions, the churches themselves,
Yeah.
maybe kept people even that weren't particularly faithful or religious, but that they came to church as a social institution. So
Mm-hmm.
within your church, within a church that you would advise or so forth, do
Yeah.
you what are those aspects of the institution that provide the fabric of maybe community? What are the things that you highlight on that?
So I think I heard a guy that I really respect one time. He's asked, like, if he was going to start a new church, what would he do? He goes, I'd find 5 couples that like to hang out and then do the church thing later on. Figure out how to do the church part, right? Find the social aspect first and then tack the religion on at the end of it. I think that's not the way that church planting happens now. It happens the other way, where it's like it's very like Jesus focused first. I think people very much underestimate the power of being around other people. I saw a Pew time use study that asked people, like, how much time you spend at work, how much time you spend with family. And if you looked at older people, they spend at least 8 hours a day alone. I mean, the loneliness epidemic in America today is something that's so understudied and understood. That's what's leading to a lot of the depression and the disaffection, and I even think drug addiction in some ways. I think the church is this great institute. Even if you don't even believe, I'm toying around writing a book called "Why You Should Go to Church," and it has nothing to do with Jesus, right? Like a social argument for the value of church, which is it has friends, it has community. If you get sick, the church shows up. If you need money, the church puts their hand out. If you just need someone to cry, the church will help you cry. When you go bury your husband or your wife, who makes the meal? The church lays at the church. Who shows up and gives you that, the handshake and the glad hand at the visitation? That's the church, right? Like that's the social capital that we miss in America today. There's no better feeling on earth than feeling like you're part of something. And I think so few people get that feeling anymore, and it makes me incredibly sad.
So, Dr. Birch, are you not a fan of the invisible church concept? Then
No, I'm all in on. I want you to be there as much as you can be. We like my church is old people, so they're all retired. So they literally, like, if you say we're going to have something on Tuesday, they show up because they want to be there. I mean, and I want to be there with them. Like so when I took the job, I was 23 years old at my current church. I was not married. I had no kids. I didn't have a master's degree at that point. I got a master's degree. I got married. I got a PhD. I had 2 kids. I renovated a house. These people have grown up with me. And I always joke that my kids have about 12 sets of grandparents. The 2 they have with their family, and then the 10 they have at church. And people will come in, they'll shake their hands, and they see my kids grow up. And it's given me the greatest sense of togetherness and belonging you could ever imagine. Being with those people at the good times and the bad times. I mean, that's what kills me about church is people want to have a wedding in the church. They want to do a funeral at the funeral home. I want the church to become the place where everything happens, the good things, the baptisms, the weddings, and the funerals, because it all happens there. That's what the church should be in American society.
So, Dr. Burge, I'm proud of us because we made it this far without asking about coronavirus. But which has to be the longest any podcast has made it in the last couple of months. But as a pastor, as someone that you're talking about the good times, the bad times, you're talking about elderly people in your own church. Obviously, this Easter was very different. Obviously, even now, and perhaps for months to come, perhaps for years to come, many churches are not going to look the same. Elderly people are not going to be able to have that sense of community. How do you reconcile that? How do you deal with that as a pastor? I mean, what is your game plan? Or do you have one?
We've talked about it in sort of broad strokes recently. We haven't met for about 6 or 7 weeks now. The middle of March, we got the order to not gather anymore in Illinois. So we heeded that order. It looks like we'll start going back the first week of June and seeing how that goes. My congregation is older, 75, 80, 85 years old. So we are particularly susceptible to coronavirus. That weighs very heavily on my mind. But the other part of me says, but the church is one of the things that gives people meaning, myself and my congregation. And I miss them. And I think they missed me too. So that's a part of it as well. We have to balance these 2 things together. And so things like not shaking hands, we're going to make sure we don't do that. We might have everyone set 6 feet apart. We might have make sure everyone's wearing a face mask and those kind of things. But I think we can't, and this is what I struggle with. we can't do this for 12 months. We can't live like this for 18 months in lockdown. It's just not sociologically, psychologically possible for us. It's not theologically possible for us in a lot of ways. So we need to find a way to still get, maybe we're not going to go back to the way it was before, with meeting together all the time and all these things, but we need to find a way to have that sense of community and togetherness and belonging now. So we're going to play it by ear. Now, luckily for us, we're a small congregation, only about 20 people. I worry about these large churches, 300 people, 500 people, 1,000 people, about payroll, right? About paying for expenses and utilities and all those kind of things. We don't have to worry about that. We're very small and the money's not a problem for us. But there's going to be a lot of churches in America that are probably going to close down after coronavirus because their offerings are going to dry up and they can't make payroll. They can't keep the lights on. And I think that's a really bad thing.
So then, as from an empirical standpoint, and then also what you're seeing with the data, how do you think this is going to have a long-term impact on the institutional churches, or will it? I mean, maybe do you feel like it'll just bounce right back?
Well, it's hard to predict what people are going to do at a time like this, obviously, because we've never had a situation where, people can't go to church for 6 or 8 weeks nationwide like this. So if we look at the data, the people who change attendance, the people who are going weekly go weekly. Like they don't change over time. Like they're locked in. That's their pattern. That's the way they go through life. The people who never go. Like that's just because that's their pattern too. The people that I worry about are like the marginally attached people, the people that go like 6 times a year to 15 times a year, right? They're not there often, but they're there sometimes. I do wonder, it's going to have one or two effects, I think. For some people, it's going to have, wow, I didn't miss that at all, so I'm not ever going to come back. Or there might be some people who go, you know what? I really missed it when I didn't have the option to go. And so now I want to go back at least as much as I did before, if not more. So right. I do think there's going to be sort of a little bit of both. And we're trying to put surveys in the field now and then another like 3 months to figure out what people are going to do and how they're going to change behavior over time.
There's a lot of political science, I'm sure, around the coronavirus that maybe has yet to come out. But I mean, when I interviewed religion journalist Terry Mattingly, who I know uses a lot of your graphs on his getreligion.org blog, I mean, he was of the opinion that people are going to end up missing church and maybe coming back even in larger numbers because they're going to crave that community.
I think that there's a possibility of that. I really do. I mean, but again, we've never had this is like a perfect experiment, social experiment, because you can't do this in a lab. You can't say you can't go outside for 6 weeks. Like that just doesn't happen. So It's impossible for us to know what American religion is going to look like in 1, 3, or 5 years. On top of that, by the way, universities are struggling. I mean, every university in America is going to struggle with Corona, tuition, all those kind of things. There's all kinds of things happening in society. Domestic violence has gone up. And severe domestic violence has gone up. Child abuse has gone up. Like these are all the things that we can't even begin to understand, all the ripples through American society this has caused. And church is just one of those things.
Well, Dr. Burge, I guess I want to ask you maybe open-ended. With everything going on now, not only the religious and political phenomenons we discussed, but also with the coronavirus, where do you see America going socially, politically, religiously, the next couple of years, 5 years, 10 years? Is our nation going to look drastically different over these coming years, or are we going to kind of settle in with some sort of a balance where, we can predict that in 10 or 20 years it'll be the same? I mean, do you think it's going to change a lot, or is it going to basically be very stable in some respect after the coronavirus and everything has washed out? Or, I mean, I guess, what's your prediction? What's your glass ball?
Oh, man. I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but I just don't see an end to the partisanship in America, the polarization in America. I think that we are entering into an unprecedented time in American history. The internet's been around for, 30 years now, and we still don't understand it. I mean, if you think about how new YouTube is and Facebook is, we can't even understand the impact of those platforms are having on the political ideology of Americans, and we'll probably not understand it for 20 more years, right? That people can go on YouTube and get fed conspiracy theories they would never see in their life and get 20 videos back to back to back about them on YouTube, something we've never seen before, right? So I don't want to be a pessimist, but I kind of have to be pessimistic. I think in every aspect of American life, we're seeing more polarization, whether it be political polarization or even religious polarization. I think we're seeing even racial polarization in a lot of ways, where racial identities come to the fore in a really sort of toxic way, in a negative way, I think. So I don't know how we get back to a time when Republicans and Democrats can look across the aisle and say, you're not all wrong. And they're like, yeah, you're not all wrong either. We can work together to get things done. I just think we're entering into a time when the left is further left and the right is further right. And you're either very, very religious or you're very, very not religious. I think all those are scary trends. And unfortunately, I think it creates a very toxic America, a very unwelcoming America, a very sad, disaffected, and isolated America where I don't know how we move forward in a positive way. Hopefully, the American spirit's an amazing thing. The human spirit's an amazing thing. We've adapted to technology over time, and it's made us better for it. I don't think we've adapted to what the internet has brought to American society just yet. But I hope in the future we find ways to use technology not to drive us apart, but to kind of pull us together.
Well, Dr. Burge, I find myself asking seemingly every guest this. I mean, because it matters a lot to me. It's the reason I started this show, frankly. But where do you think you can find the facts these days? Where do you think you can find good news, straight news? If you want to, look at what's going on, is there any source in your view that gets it right? Other than the Jess Field show, of course, is there anybody providing straight facts and straight news? I mean, really, is honestly, because it does seem that the polarization is something that everyone recognizes. But then when you ask them, what is your favorite news outlet? Well, then they maybe would state something that is an opinion heavy outlet. But, journalism professor Dale Rice told me he thought there were a few neutral outlets left. Do you think there are?
I don't think I can't name one specific outlet that I would say you should go to this outlet and get the news from. What I think is it's the aggregate for me. So I think like Twitter is a great and terrible thing all at one time. Like I hate it and I love it. I think in the aggregate, if you follow people from both sides of the political spectrum and not nutty people on both sides, like just, solid Democrats, solid Republicans who just see the world differently, but don't hate the other party. You follow what they share and what they're talking about from both sides. And I think in the aggregate of all that, you sort of get what the story actually is. Like that sort of emerges through, but it's not, you can't just read one article, right? You got to read written from this side and that side. But and here's the thing, and this is so hard. We have to constantly be thinking and self-reflecting about what we believe and why we believe it and what the story is doing to us, right? Am I reading too much liberal stuff? Am I reading too much conservative stuff? Why is that story wrong, or what could be wrong about the story? What's the interpretation of that story? I'll give you one quick example about mail-in voting, okay? A lot of Republicans don't like mail-in voting because they say it can be easily manipulated. That's what they say. And there's a story that came out on the right-wing blogosphere that said 28.6 million mail-in ballots went missing over the last 4 election cycles. 28.6 million. I'm like, oh my gosh, like that's a problem. Let me go digging here. Let me go see what this story's really about. I went digging. You know what they classified as missing? Any ballot that was mailed out that was not returned, they called missing. That's not a missing. A missing ballot means it got like sent to like a ballot farming factory somewhere, where they like marked, they stuffed the ballot box. If someone gets mailed a ballot and they put it in the recycling bin, that's not nefarious. But if you say 28.6 million ballots were not returned, that doesn't have the bite of 28.6 million ballots went missing. You see my point here, right? It's just a subtle twist of the words, which has a totally different meaning. And if you know what, we talk about turnout, let's say 60% of voters, registered voters turn out. Did we say 40% of voters went missing on election day? No, they just didn't go vote. Right? So we have to be very careful about the language people are using and what the purpose of the language they're using is all about. I think we constantly have to be thinking, and unfortunately that's hard work. Cognitively, that's hard work because we're lazy. I'm lazy too. But we constantly have to be thinking about the agenda and the facts. And if 3 stories all agree from different outlets, and that's the facts, right? But we can't read one outlet or 2 outlets. We have to read outlets from both sides that try, at least they have a hard news division that tries to get things down the line. And for goodness sakes, if all you're reading is Breitbart on one side and Daily Caller on one side, or Daily Kos on the other side, or Think Progress on the other side, you're not doing it right. You're not doing it right. Okay. You're just being told what you want to hear. And that's not what an American citizen is supposed to be. So my argument would be in the aggregate, you can get it right, but you got to read a lot of stuff from a lot of different outlets. And in the middle of all that, you kind of find the truth.
So speaking of facts, Dr. Burge, you are a big fan of data, of course, and
Yes.
your Twitter feed is a veritable internet library of charts, graphs, statistics, very, very interesting stuff. But I know you
Mm-hmm.
do a lot more than just tweet. So
Yep.
please plug everything you do so that anybody interested in
Sure.
what you are doing, what you're writing, can learn about it. And I hear you have a book maybe coming out before too long here in the
Yeah.
next year or so.
Yep. So if you want to really follow what I'm up to, you can follow me at Ryan Burge on Twitter. I usually post everything I do there. BURGERYANBURG. My website is ryanburge.net, has all the papers I've written, has like a whole page of links of stuff I've written, articles for popular outlets, but also things like for journals. So I post all of them there too. I co-edit and founded a website called Religion in Public, religioninpublic.blog. We write 2 or 3 pieces a month there. It's all social scientists with PhDs writing about religion and politics in American life. It's all empirical. It's all, it's good work. It's strong academic work. Some of it's not the easiest thing to read ever, but we try to make it as accessible as we can with good graphs and good analysis. So religioninpublic.blog. I write for Christianity Today sometimes. I write for Religion News Service. I write for Barna sometimes. Terry Mattingly features me. I work a lot of times on getreligion.org. But if you go to @Ryan Burge, that's where you'll find all this information. And I do have a book coming out next February, maybe, depending on what happens with COVID. It might get shifted around based on, when we go off lockdown and all that kind of stuff. So when that gets closer, I'll be putting more information out about that on my Twitter feed at Ryan Burge. So that's where to get at me.
So what's the book about?
It's called The Nuns, Where They Came From, Who They Are, and Where They're Going. And it is about 200 pages, 42 graphs, about 32,000 words about the religiously unaffiliated folks. I spent a whole chapter talking about 8 different reasons why the nuns have risen so quickly. I show you sort of a broad view of the American religious landscape, and I break down the nuns in the different categories. The atheist, agnostics, nothing in particular. I show you how they're different, gender-wise, education-wise. A lot of things I talked about today are stuff that I did for the book. So it was really written for the audience is denominational leaders, pastors, seminarians, people who teach apologetics courses, world religions courses. So it's written for a general audience, but I think it's sort of a cheat sheet for people who want to know how to reach out to the religiously unaffiliated. I think it would give them a ton of great information about how to do that. So that's going to come out probably February or March of next year.
Very interesting. Dr. Burge, is there anything you'd like to close with or any final comments you'd like to leave folks with that have listened to this interesting discussion?
No, I mean, just be good to each other. That's I know it sounds so trite, man. That's what everyone you meet is going through a battle just as hard as yours, if not harder. I think that's something that I constantly have to tell myself, especially during this time, and show grace to people. I've had to constantly remind myself to my students who turn things in late or turn in incomplete assignments that I need to show grace to my students and to my fellow man, because we're all going through this together, and certain people are struggling more than other people. And man, wouldn't the world be a better place if we showed more grace and more mercy and more kindness and less judgment? So
good words. Thank you so much, Dr. Burge. Ryan Burge, professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University, as well as a prominent author on religious and political issues, and has a book coming out, and also, of course, a pastor in the American Baptist denomination. Dr. Burge, thank you for joining me today.
Grace and peace to you.
And that was Dr. Ryan Burge, professor of political science at Eastern Illinois University and a pastor in the American Baptist denomination. If you like the show, please subscribe on YouTube or in your favorite podcast app. We're now on iHeartRadio podcasts. And if you have an idea for a guest, send me an email at jessfieldsshow@gmail.com. Thanks for listening.